Possessed by a Dark Warrior, Eternal Mate's Paranormal Romance Series, Book 9, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 12. Taryn paced her room, her legs trembling and body aching, but not from fear or her brother's attack. No, it was a dream that had left her weak and shaking, and in the most delicious way. She shoved that thought out of her head. It had no place in her mind or in her heart, not when the dream she had experienced had felt more real than ever, more dangerous than ever. The elf male had slept in time with her, and that vision had been a strange reality, shared between them as if they had been together, not countless leagues apart in separate beds. Each touch, sound, taste, sight, and emotion had flowed through her, wrapped around her and left her lost in the male, in the passion and desire, and the sweet high of a coming together that had burned her to ashes. She had often wondered how it would feel if they slept at the same time, sharing a vision, but she had never imagined that wild and frenzied need, that heat and hunger, and the sheer bliss she had experienced. Bliss that had her quivering still, bone-deep satisfied. Gods, dear gods! If the male could make being with him that intoxicating and powerful in her dreams, what could he do in reality? It didn't bear thinking about. She wasn't sure she would survive it. She tried to divert the course of her thoughts away from the elf male and back to her brother, but the damned male refused to leave her, and her mind kept conjuring images from her dream, visions of them naked and tangled together, lost in the throes of passion. She closed her eyes and gave herself over to those images, imagining him stroking his fingers over her bare skin, teasing her senses with the light caress. Her fingers trailed where his would, caressing over her right breast to catch her pebbled nipple before he dropped lower, sweeping his touch over the flare of her hip, torturing her with the anticipation of where he would head next. Taryn bit her lip and skimmed her hand down the flat of her belly. A feral growl rumbled through the castle, and her hand stilled, her heart leaping into her throat as she swung her gaze towards the wooden door of her apartment. Her brother had returned. She swallowed hard, trying to get her heart back down into her chest, and used her limited magic to call her clothes, dressing in a pair of violet leathers and a cream corset. Fury flowed through the building, reaching under her door to caress around her ankles before swirling upwards to encompass her. Her brother was angry about something. She rushed to the door, yanked it open, and hurried barefoot down the corridor, the black stone cool beneath her bare feet. Her violet-to-white hair bounced across her bare shoulders with each stride, and her eyes charted the course ahead of her as she increased her speed, concerned her brother was angry with her. Or worse, what if the elf male had been closer than she had thought? Gods help him if he had been caught by Tenak. When trying to hide the sword, Taryn had seen the cells in the dungeon of the castle, had scented the dried blood on the flagstones that had been old, but not old enough. Her brother didn't only kill trespassers who entered his valley. Sometimes he did far worse. A female scream reached her ears, and she skidded to a halt at the top of the grand staircase in the vestibule, legs trembling and heart racing as she smelled blood. She shook her head, feet frozen to the spot even as a small courageous part of her said to intervene and stop whatever madness her brother was inflicting on the innocent female. The greater part of herself was already too far gone, plunging deep into her memories, pulling up the darkness from the depth of her soul and throwing the black veil over her. Her knees struck the smooth stone, her breath leaving her in a rush as those memories swallowed her, and the darkness held her in a grip so fierce she couldn't breathe, could only feel. Cold hands on her skin, hot breath on her neck, words whispered in her ear, a threat meant to stir fear that would weaken her, allowing the male to break her. Taryn clawed at her hair and then at the male, shoving him away, fighting him as he tried to force himself on her. She raked talons over his flesh, scoring deep and spilling blood, dug them into his skin until they hit bone and snarled through sharp teeth at him, snapping and growling, determined to take a chunk out of his neck and end him. Strong hands clasped her upper arms, pinning them against her chest, and then she was on her back, those same hands pressing down hard on her shoulders. Her dragon instincts roared to life and she lashed out, kicking and clawing, shrieking at the male as the transformation coursed through her. The collar around her neck didn't stop it this time. She roared as her form shifted, bones growing and scales rippling over her skin, and threw her head back as wings sprouted from her back, stretching wide to span the entrance hall. Her front paws hit the floor of the vestibule, one back leg remaining on the upper level and one on the staircase. Terran! That word was a blur in her ears, unfamiliar and strange, even when a dim part of her thought she should know it. She knew nothing but fury, pain, and rage, and a hunger to kill. She reared back and lowered her gaze to the one who had spoken, a male. Her jowls peeled back off her fangs as she growled at him, her eyes narrowing and focus sharpening on the male. Blood pumped from deep gashes in his left side, coursing over his bare skin, seeping into the waist of his purple leathers. Blood that coated her claws, too. She raked her eyes over him, snarled when she saw the ties of his trousers were open. He meant to break her. She swept her paw down, slammed it into the male, and sent him flying across the room. He grunted as he hit the wall, the sound satisfying but not enough, a mere hit of pleasure that birthed a hunger for another taste. She dropped to all four paws in the cramped space, twisted her body so she could reach the male, and lashed out at him again. He leaped, springing high into the air, and she snarled as he landed on her paw as it struck the ground where he had been. Infuriating male. Terran! That word again. This time it gave her pause, sparking a strange sensation within her. She shook it away and lashed out again, sweeping her other paw around to catch the male. He growled as he twisted through the air, spinning, limbs flying in all directions, and barked out a delicious cry as he hit the wall above the arched entrance and then slammed into the floor. She turned to strike him again and fell to her right, the awkward angle of having her hind legs at the top of the staircase tipping her off balance. She crashed hard into the wall, whimpered as her right wing bent back, and flinched as her jaw cracked on the floor, and the banister of the staircase jabbed into her ribs. The male picked himself up, and she snorted as he approached her, a soft look on his bloodied face. He rubbed his right hand across his chest, smearing it with his blood, and held it out to her. Terran, stop this! She snorted again and stilled as she caught the scent of his blood. Warmth flowed through her, a sensation that drove out the fear and left her sinking against the black wall and floor, her strength draining from her. As it rushed out of her, she couldn't hold her dragon form, and the world around her dulled as she shifted, her wings and tail disappearing, and horns shrinking into her skin and scales sinking back into her flesh. She breathed hard as she lay on her side, awareness slowly dawning, clearing the haze from her mind. Her eyes gradually widened and she looked at her brother, found him standing a short distance from her, holding his injured arm to his side. The tender edge to his violet-to-white eyes didn't soothe her this time, couldn't steal away the pain and the anger. He stooped to help her, and she shoved him back and clothed herself before pushing onto her feet. She glared at him, fire burning through her blood, rage that she knew would blaze forever in her. 6 masters, 300 years, 1,000 lifetimes of pain and suffering. Nothing could erase that from her past. No one could fix what had been broken. Terran, Tenak started, and she turned on him with a black snarl, flashing her sharp teeth at him and warning him to keep his distance. He backed off a step and lowered his hand to his side, but the hurt in his eyes wasn't enough to make her forgive him or desire to speak with him. Not when he smelled of fey blood and sex. Never, never bring a female into this castle again, she snarled and advanced on him, her chest heaving against her leather corset, as the fury in her veins reached boiling point. I will kill you next time. His eyes widened and then narrowed, darkness clouding them as his fingers curled into fists at his sides. If he tried to fight her, he would learn what 3 centuries of hell had taught her. How to kill without remorse. How to survive. He drew down a deep breath, but she didn't relax. Not even when his hands uncurled and his shoulders sagged. his stance shifting to a non-threatening one. "I am sorry," he said, but the apology wasn't enough. Nothing he could say would be enough. All males like him deserved to die. Whatever doubts she had been having about her mission, he had snuffed them all out of existence, leaving her conscience clear and heart strong, determined to carry out her plan. He reached for her again, and she glared at the hand he offered, one that had no doubt held the female in place or covered her mouth to stifle her screams. Terrence snarled at it. "Speak to me, sister." He wisely withdrew his hand. "Tell me what happened to you." She lifted her eyes to lock with his and growled the words she had long ago sworn to herself, when she had come close to surrendering, so tired from the constant fight against her captors, her spirit on the verge of breaking, a moment of weakness that she had to live with, together with 300 years of shame. "Never. I will never speak of it to anyone." Because no one would love her if they knew. Chapter 13. In terms of epiphanies, this was a major fucking one. Blue stared at the white tabletop in the break room of the nightclub, heart banging around in his chest as everything crashed over him. He felt Iolanthe's gaze on him, questioning him, and sensed her concern, but he couldn't bring himself to look at her and couldn't find his voice to speak and tell her that he was fine. Would be fine once his entire world stopped rocking and tilting anyway. He had never been the sort to feel lonely, and had long ago given up on his dream of finding his fated female. He had been fine with his life as a bachelor, married to his work with Lauren and the kingdom. He had been lying to himself. He had been filling his life with work and shallow, fleeting relationships because he had been covering the truth, unable to face it because he knew it would change his world and nothing he did would stop that from happening. When he had seen his friends finding their fated ones and falling in love as they set out on a new path with their mate at their side, he had avoided them because he had been subconsciously trying to avoid the truth, a truth he had been avoiding for the past 7 centuries. The dragon was his fated one. He had known it the moment he had first tangled with her on the battlefield in the elf kingdom, shortly after she had stolen the sword, and the knowledge of what she was to him and to his kingdom had torn him in 2 directions. She was both his Kiara and the sworn enemy of his species. In response to that knowledge, he had done what he did best. He had hurled himself into his position in the army and his work in order to avoid looking too closely at the recognition that had sparked to life inside him that day. He had shoved it to the back of his mind and had been so persistent in his desire to forget it that he had somehow managed it. Centuries later, he had forgotten he had even found his mate, had merely believed that he had decided to set aside that dream he had always told Iolanthe about. Gods, it had been there in the back of his mind, locked deep in his heart all along, though. A soul-deep awareness that he couldn't have his mate that had colored everything in his life, making him view them as a nuisance and then making him jealous when he had seen others find theirs, able to start a life together with them, one he could never have with his female. He had buried himself in work because he couldn't have her. He had condemned himself to a life alone, one cold and devoid of love and light. He hadn't even tried. He had been a fucking idiot. He groaned and tipped his head back, stared at the slightly grubby white-tiled ceiling of the break room. Lauren had told him once, several thousand years ago, that with age came wisdom. He wasn't sure that was the case for him. 7 centuries ago, he had been old enough that he should have recognized the dragon female as his mate, his dream come true, and he should have done something. He shouldn't have given up on her so easily. His kingdom and his position meant something to him, but was it worthy of the sacrifice he had made? He had changed himself, discarded the male who had always dreamed of finding his mate, and had denied his true nature. Seeing how fiercely Lauren had fought for Olivia, and Kiter for Iolanthe, and even damned Thorn for Sable, had set him on edge for some reason, and at the time he hadn't been able to name it, but now he could. It had made him angry, with himself. Every male he knew had fought to claim his mate, and he had fought to forget his. He wasn't sure what kind of male that made him, But he didn't like it, and it was time he changed. Well, it was time he changed back. He could no longer deny his true nature. He couldn't bring himself to believe that there was a chance for him in the female, but he could finally see that it was a possibility. Nothing was impossible after all. He had proven that countless times, and he should have tried to prove it with her too. He had been wrong to believe that everyone but him was finding their mate. His was out there, waiting, running from him. Gods, the thought of having her set his blood on fire, but chilled him at the same time. He wasn't really sure of himself now or what the future held for him. Everything that had happened in the past few months had tipped him off balance, but he wasn't going to just give up and throw in the towel. He was going to figure everything out and come up with a strategy, one that would bring him and the female dragon together and give him a chance to speak with her. It would be difficult now that he had brought Leif, Dacian, and Finn in on the hunt for her. He cursed the gods. The trio would want to pursue the original plan of reclaiming the sword, and they wouldn't care whether the culprit was caught or killed in the process. He couldn't even tell them that Lauren had issued an order to capture the dragon, because their prince had issued the exact opposite. In writing. He cursed Lauren this time. The male was only doing his duty, but Blue wished he hadn't followed it to the letter this time. Normally, Lauren allowed teams out on special missions without a written warrant. Maybe Blue should have cursed the council. It was their constant bickering with Lauren and pressuring him to stick firmly to the rules in order to placate them and restore some balance between him and the elders that had no doubt made Lauren bother to issue his team mission orders in a formal manner. Blue groaned. He wasn't even sure whether attempting to speak with the female was the right course of action. She had attacked his people, had killed thousands of his kin, and had stolen the most precious treasure of his prince. He knew that to be true, even when there was a piece of him that wanted to believe it wasn't. He had seen the sword on her person when he had first met her, and there was no denying that, not even when it pained him to accept it. His fated female was the enemy of his people. His enemy. "Brother," Iolanthe whispered softly, and his groan deepened as he remembered that he wasn't alone. He dragged a hand over his face and sat up, found her watching him closely with an edge of concern in her eyes. "I'm just tired." Another lie. He really had to stop lying to his sister, but it was easier than spilling the truth. His fated female was a murderer, and he had orders to kill her. "It is the dragon, is it not? The mission plays on your mind and weighs on your heart for some reason." Blue gazed off to his right, to the door there, and sighed. "A little, but it is nothing for you to worry about." Her eyes didn't leave him, and he knew she wanted to say that she couldn't simply stop worrying about him. She didn't need to tell him. He shifted his gaze to her and held it, silently letting her know that. The bane of being a sibling, he supposed. One was always worried about the other for some reason. "You could help me," he said, and she perked up, sitting straighter in her chair, her violet eyes bright with enthusiasm that he scowled at because he knew the source of it. "I'm not asking you to come with me." She huffed, her fine eyebrows knitting together and lips flattening into a mulish line as she folded her arms across her chest. "Gods, you two look frighteningly alike sometimes." Kiter strolled into the break room, the overlong gray sweats he wore swishing around his bare feet, and yawned fiercely, his face screwing up as he flashed short fangs. He shuffled towards the counter in the kitchen area, scrubbing a hand over his musk-sandy hair. "I need coffee. Coffee, coffee, sweet coffee." He opened the cupboard on the wall above the coffee pot and fumbled with a blue mug, barely catching it before it hit the dark counter, and set it down as he yawned again. "Did we wake you?" Iolanthe said as she turned in her chair to look at Kiter, all sweetness and light now that her mate was around. The transformation was startling but impressive. Blue had never noticed the true depth of the effect Kiter had on her mood, but he couldn't fail to see it now. She had gone from irritated and grumpy to bright smiles in a heartbeat, her cheeks flushed with heat and eyes sparkling. Blue eyed the sandy-haired, golden-skinned male in the kitchen and frowned. He couldn't see the appeal himself. Kiter was amusing at times, a good friend at others, but the rest of the time he was annoying as hell. The Jaguar shifter yawned so hard that his eyes closed, and the coffee he was pouring into his mug hit the brim and flowed down the sides and all over the counter. "Fuck," Kiter muttered and mopped up the mess. When he turned around, he scowled at Blue. "That was your fault." Blue frowned right back at him. "My fault? I fail to see how you spilling coffee is my fault." Kiter slumped into the chair to his left, between him and Iolanthe, kicked his bare feet up onto the white table and sank lower, his coffee held in both hands above his naked torso. The male slid a mischievous look his way. "It was your lusty screams waking me at this fucking ungodly hour." Blue growled at him, flashing fangs in warning. The bastard just winked at him, the look in his eyes making it clear that he knew what had had Blue crying out. Iolanthe's gaze burned into him, and he didn't dare look at her, didn't want to see how horrified she looked as she stared at him. "I told you I was fighting," he said. "No, you said you were having a nightmare." "I was." Blue shot her a look that demanded she let it go, one he'd had to use 1,000 times on her in the past when she had been stubborn and acting like a hell beast with a bone. Kiter grinned. "So we're up in the middle of the fucking day because Blue was having dirty dreams?" Blue hissed at him this time, his ears flaring back against the sides of his head, unable to contain the reaction or stop himself from threatening the male, and confirming that he had been lost in a fantasy and not a nightmare, judging by the wicked smiles Kiter and Iolanthe exchanged. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared at both of them. Kiter shuddered and muttered, "Far too alike." Iolanthe petted her mate's leg and spoke to him. Blue paid her no heed as he tried to figure out a way to convince both of them that he hadn't been having a dirty dream. It was only when she mentioned dragons and the sword that he dragged himself back to the room. "Do you tell him everything now, even things that were told you in private?" Blue frowned at her. She shrugged. "We are mates. Mates tell each other everything." Fantastic. He couldn't wait to come back to Underworld and have Kiter tease him about his desire to find his own fated female, and everything else he had just confessed to his little sister. "Since we are going to talk about my mission, perhaps you could help me. I need all the information you have about the Dragon Realm and the borders with the Devil's Domain. Veo believes the sword is there, and you have traveled extensively in that area." He was about to tack on an order in the elf tongue to keep his private matters to herself when Kiter spoke. "If you want information on the Dragon Realms and beyond, why don't you just ask Loki?" "I would if I knew the dragon's location. Prince Lorne will not give it to me." He was also fairly certain that Lorne would be angry with him for openly ignoring the promise he had made to the dragon, swearing he would leave him alone. But Blue hadn't made that promise, and he wouldn't be breaking it if he visited the dragon male and questioned him. The more he considered it, the more he wanted to do it. It would certainly stop him from wondering why Loki had pressed his prince to swear such a thing in the first place, when Loki had given him no information on the female dragon or the sword. Blue had always obeyed his gut, and his gut was screaming that the dragon knew more than he had told Lauren. It was time he spoke with the male himself. He looked across at Kiter. "You know where Loki lives?" "No," Kiter said, and Blue was on the verge of snapping at him and asking why in the gods' names he had mentioned the male then, when the Jaguar shifter jerked his thumb towards Iolanthe. "But she does. She teleported Aeneas there once when Loki went radio silent and the huntress was worried." He shifted his focus to his sister. "I have a huge favor to ask you." Chapter 14. Green swirled around Blue as his feet hit the ground in the center of the portal landing zone, the air surrounding him shimmering with the telltale trail of his teleport. He strode forwards across the dewy grass, his back to the glowing portal suspended in the sky that acted as the sun in the elf kingdom. The warm light threw his shadow out long in front of him, stretching it towards the pale stone garrison a short distance away on a hill. He focused on the squat two-story building that stood in the center of a circular defensive wall and willed his portal. Power rippled over him and cool darkness followed it, a split second of infinite night that evaporated to reveal the arched wooden gate of the stronghold he and the others were to call home for the foreseeable future. Blue looked back in the direction of the landing zone, one of the few places in the kingdom where those teleporting into it could enter. It was closer than he remembered, and he would have been concerned if they had been tracking any species who could use the portal pathways into the elf realm, but they weren't. Dragons didn't have the ability to teleport. He had never heard of them using the gates either, a method that allowed fey species such as shifters to enter hell or travel around it. No, if the female dragon attacked them, she would do so from the air, and that meant coming over the mountains to the rear of the old garrison. She would have to cross the first realm. Blue looked towards it. He would send word to the demons, asking them to look out for dragons. The sound of metal clashing pulled his focus away from the numerous smaller duties he needed to perform as part of his mission. A grunt and growl followed it. Blue huffed and gritted his teeth, praying to the gods for patience. Someone was sparring. He banged his right fist on the huge arched door and waited. After a few seconds, it creaked open and Finn appeared in view, grinning from ear to ear. It wobbled a little as he looked at Blue, and Blue pinned him with an ice-cold glare meant to freeze the damn thing off his face. Dacian and Leif were the ones battling it out in the courtyard then. Blue had seen them spar before, and it had been less of a fight with weapons and more of a battle of wills. A battle that had gone on far too long, neither willing to admit defeat. Despite the difference in their builds, Dacian and Leif were too well matched, both skilled warriors with centuries of experience under their belts. Both stubborn bastards, too. He couldn't afford to have this sparring match end as the last one he had witnessed had, with Leif sporting broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, and Dacian sitting on his backside with his tibia jutting out of his left leg. Finn drummed his fingers against the throwing knives strapped on both sides of his ribs over his black armor. The nervous twitch only grew in speed as Blue slid him a black look that meant to convey how annoyed he was that they had gone against one of his orders, the one he thought he had hammered into their thick skulls with enough force to make it stick. No one sparred, because heading into the dragon realm when injured was a death sentence, and they couldn't delay the mission to wait for anyone to heal. Blue shot him another glare, and then strode across the pale smooth flagstones toward the central building, and the two idiots going at it just outside it. He issued the command to his armor as he walked. The tiny scales rushed up his arms from the bands around his wrist and down his body, covering him just as his mortal clothes disappeared, sent away via his portal to the apartment in the main castle of the kingdom. Anything he owned he could teleport. Right now, he was debating teleporting his sword to his hand and beating some sense into Leif, Dacian, and even Finn. "Funny, but I believe I gave an order," he barked in the elf tongue, and both Leif and Dacian froze with their weapons held mid-swing. They slowly turned to face him, and he stopped a short distance from them, set his jaw and folded his arms across his chest, pressing the tips of his naked fingers into his biceps to stop himself from calling his blade. "I could arrange for another team, perhaps one more willing to follow the orders I issue." He shifted his gaze from Dacian, who rocked back on his heels into a relaxed position and lowered his black broadsword to his side, to Leif. The slender male calmly sent his blade away and ran a hand over his short hair. He could act nonchalant all he wanted, but Blue could see straight through it to the nerves he was trying to hide. If he sent them back to the castle, it would be in disgrace and with black marks against their names. Leif's family would probably request punishment for him as recompense for him tarnishing their noble name with such insubordination. Blue wouldn't be surprised if Dacian's family went one further and asked for his execution. While the two were matched in battle, they couldn't be further apart in standing. Dacian came from a long line of warriors. Leif came from a long line of pompous, self-entitled nobles. Blue knew which side of elf society he preferred. He looked back at Finn where he still stood near the door, stroking his blades. If he had to choose, Blue would stand with Finn. His family were farmers. They might have that in common, but it wouldn't stop Blue from setting him to rights when he confessed whatever misdeed it was that he was trying to hide. He wasn't nervous because Blue had caught Leif and Dacian sparring. Something else had happened. He looked back at Dacian and Leif and scrutinized them both, noticing now that there were no towels or refreshment waiting at the sidelines, and no ring on the ground to mark the boundary of their battle. All things soldiers normally did when sparring. Both males were wearing their armor, too. Because they hadn't been sparring, they had been fighting. He rolled his eyes and sighed, and he had thought it couldn't get worse. He was beginning to remember why he preferred to work alone. Leif blurted, "Dacian and Finn went to the Dragon Realm." "Fucking wonderful," Blue snarled and decided not to pray to the gods, because they certainly weren't listening, and he wasn't even sure their counsel would be enough to stop him from spilling blood today. He snapped his fingers. The air shifted around him, and Finn was suddenly between Dacian and Leif. All three of them pressed their right hands to their armored chests, directed their eyes straight forwards, and stood tall with their feet together. It seemed he still had some authority. "I would love an explanation." He looked around, spotted a stone bench near the side wall of the central building, and reached his hand out to it and focused on it. Using telekinesis on large, heavy objects was taxing at the best of times, when an elf had a clear mind, so he wasn't surprised when it accidentally smacked Dacian in his right arm, knocking the male forward and tearing a pained grunt from his lips. In Dacian's defense, he did regain his salute and perfect pose before the bench had even reached Blue. A warrior born and bred. Blue set the bench down in front of him, stepped over it, and seated himself. He eyed all three males. "I am waiting. When you failed to return as agreed, we thought it pertinent to assess the situation in the Dragon Realm as a team, venturing to a few of the villages that border the Third Realm to reconnoiter them from a safe distance." Dacian's deep voice was smooth and even, and Blue raised an eyebrow. He was nervous, fearful that Blue would send him back to the castle. It was always a dead giveaway when he scrounged together the fanciest words he knew in an attempt to sound more authoritative. In a normal situation, Dacian would have said something more like, "You didn't come back and we were bored, so we went ahead and scouted the villages while we waited for your scrawny arse to return. You have a problem with that?" Blue appreciated that he had failed to return as agreed, but he didn't appreciate that his team had been so quick to disobey his orders. The sparkle in Finn's violet eyes was beginning to make him look as if he might explode if he didn't speak soon, so Blue turned his focus to the male. Finn rushed out, "One of the dragon clans were in an uproar when we tried to go there." Nothing unusual about that, since dragons often fought amongst themselves. The glimmer that remained in Finn's eyes said that this particular uproar had been something other than the standard in-clan squabbling, though, and that Finn wanted him to ask before he would tell him whatever news had excited him. "Go on." Blue waved his left hand in the air, too tired to join in as required by the younger elf. Finn's expression lost some of its enthusiasm, but enough remained that Blue had to wonder where he got his energy. He couldn't remember ever being that filled with energy as a young male. Maybe he had been before the war with Vale had erupted and changed him. Finn had never had to watch close to 1,000 fellow soldiers being slain by their own commander. Blue schooled his features as he slowly snuffed out of existence every feeling that welled up on thinking about that day, not allowing any of his men to see the pain it still caused him. He was their commander now, the commander of the entire elf army. He owed it to them and every other soldier to stand strong and lead them to the best of his abilities, even when they were a challenge and disobeyed him, testing his patience. "Of all things, there was an angel present," Finn said with a wide smile. "An angel!" That made Blue's blood run cold. An angel in hell? Sable had been hiding out in the Third Realm ever since an Echelon angel had made his presence known to her, demanding she come with him to heaven. She had been convinced that she would be safe in hell, and she should have been. Angels never entered this realm. It pained them to do so, weakened them, and left them vulnerable. But one was causing havoc in the Dragon Realm. He didn't like it one bit, and he wanted to investigate it, but he didn't have time. He would get word to Sable somehow, and maybe he could look into what the angel was doing. "Since you and Dacian enjoy visiting the Dragon Realm so much, you will head back there." Blue rose to his feet, and all three males stiffened, their right hands pressing harder against their chests. At least they were beginning to behave in a more acceptable manner again. I want you to scout the village we met the dragon in when she kindly left her mark on me. I have the feeling that it hadn't been chance that she had been there. It might be her clan, and that means you need to be on guard. Do not stray from each other. Understood? Finn's left fingers twitched as if he wanted to stroke his blades, and Blue shot him a look that commanded him to speak. But the village, we thought the same thing. We went to scout it, and that's where the angel was. Interesting. He was even more curious about the angel now, and this was his golden opportunity to uncover what the creature was doing in hell. All the better. You will question the clan members about both the female dragon and the angel. I have the feeling you'll be able to get some information out of the clan this time. He turned away from the trio and paced a short distance across the courtyard before turning back, using the automatic motion to clear his head. They will believe she had something to do with bringing the angel to them, and I'm sure if you press hard enough, they will talk. It isn't every day you see a violet and white dragon, after all. Someone there must know her, and they'll speak if you link the angel to her. If that fails, they will no doubt speak for the right price. Leif arched an eyebrow at that, and Blue ignored him. Nobles were tetchy about the wealth of the kingdom. A few jewels out of the realm's coffers for those dragons who offered solid information was hardly going to bankrupt the kingdom, and if that information led to the capture of the dragon and the return of the sword, it would be worth the cost 1,000 times over. That sword meant everything to Lauren and Vale, and in the wrong hands it was a death knell waiting to ring across all the lands of hell. "What are my orders?" Leif said, his tone holding a cold edge, one that Blue was used to because he was sure he sounded the same when he was mulling over a mission, itching to get going. "You will come with me." Blue stopped in front of him and looked straight into his purple eyes. "I have a lead we will check out." A very big lead. A very big blue lead that would probably eat him if he went alone. He held his hand out to Leif and looked in the direction of the dragon realm as he pictured the location Iolanthe had teleported him to just hours ago. He had considered going in alone, or with her at his side as his backup, but flying solo probably would have gotten him killed, and he wouldn't risk Iolanthe, sure that the dragon would be upset when he showed up and started questioning him after Lauren had promised to leave him alone. Plus, he had already been late returning to his men, and he really hadn't wanted to have to endure a marathon session of Leif giving him the gimlet glare whenever they were together. The male held grudges, especially where missions were concerned and when he felt he was being excluded. Leif's temperament had snagged him a spot on interrogation duty with him, and not only to spare Blue his wrath. The male had influence among the others. They looked up to him. He was also the biggest threat to the female, the one most likely to demand they obey the kill order that Lauren had issued. If Loki gave Blue any information about the female dragon, any shred of something positive that might give him cause to order a stay of execution for her, then he wanted Leif to hear it firsthand, straight from the dragon's mouth. Leif placed his hand on Blue's, his fingers closing around Blue's wrist. Blue gripped the male's arm and willed his portal to open. The green-purple light chased over both of them, darkness swallowing them whole, and then they were standing on the side of a black mountain, a valley stretching before them. Wind whipped up the side of the mountain, battering him and Leif. The male released his arm and a blade appeared in it. Blue caught his wrist. "We are not here to fight. You will not need a weapon." Leif didn't look convinced, but he sent the sword away and nodded. Blue pointed to a ledge and the dark mouth of a cave, waited for Leif to nod again to show he had seen it, and then teleported solo to it. He walked forwards into the large cave, gaze scanning the meager contents. A fire blazed in the center, illuminating the black rough walls and a small stack of books and boxes beside the left wall. On the opposite side of the fire, a blanket covered the ground. Dragons had such basic tendencies. He curled his lip at the thought of sleeping on the hard ground. A feral roar blasted through the cave, piercing his ears and making them ring. He flinched back and quickly scanned the area ahead of him again. Not quick enough. The bare-chested, blue-haired male barreled into him, taking him down onto the hard ground he had just been dissing, and so much for not being here to fight or needing a weapon. Blue grunted as his back hit the rock, the impact with it and the weight of the male landing on top of him pushing the air from his lungs. He sensed Leif landing on the ledge before the dragon male whipped his head up and growled, bright blue eyes swirling like fire as he pinned them on his companion. Blue used his momentary distraction against him, pressing his feet and shoulders into the ground and using all of his strength to lurch upwards in an attempt to dislodge the male. An attempt that failed dismally and angered the dragon. Strong hands closed around Blue's throat, and the male growled down at him, lips peeling back off teeth that were all as sharp as Blue's own fangs. The dragon bore down on him, and Blue wheezed as he fought for air. "Unhand him, you wretched beast!" Leif snarled, and gods, could he sound any more lofty and noble? Blue refused to die with those ridiculous words ringing in his fuzzy mind. He bucked up again, and the dragon responded by pressing harder against his throat, squeezing it so tightly that Blue lost the ability to breathe at all. The male leaned closer and growled right in his face, a hank of his bright blue hair falling down across his brow. "Keep away from Terran." Terran? His heart gave a painful, hard beat that had nothing to do with the fact he was about to suffocate. Was that her name? Gods, he could go to his death with that ringing in his mind. Gladly. "Loki!" A sharp female voice shattered the tense silence. "Get your bloody hands off him right this second!" A slender hand clutched the male's bare left shoulder and hauled him back. The dragon glared at it. "It is him!" Loki husked, and then pinned Blue with a black look that promised more pain than he was already experiencing, which was saying something since his vision was going dark now. Him? Blue would have frowned at that, but his body felt strangely unresponsive. The dragon had told him to stay away from Terran, and now he was insinuating that he knew him somehow. But Blue had never met him before. The female appeared in his dim vision and began pulling at Loki's wrists, her blonde ponytail bouncing against her burgundy t-shirt with each attempt, that only jerked Blue's head off the black ground before making it smack painfully hard against it again, derailing his train of thought. "Both of you! Let him go, or I will cut you down!" Leif loomed over him, eyes bright violet and pointed ears flared back against the sides of his head, as he aimed the tip of his sword at the dragon and then the female. Big mistake. Loki roared again, launched off Blue, and slammed into Leif. "You dare threaten my mate?" "Oh, just fucking great." The mate in question threw her hands up in the air and got onto her feet. "Seriously, this testosterone bullshit has to stop." She brushed her blue jeans down, taking her time about it, considering that her mate had Leif in a chokehold, and the elf was turning red as he struggled to break free. Blue slowly found his feet, swaying a little but determined to remain upright, and tried breathing. It hurt. Each breath he managed to pull down his battered throat scraped it raw. The blonde female's deep blue eyes issued a silent apology. He rubbed his throat, wincing as even the lightest touch hurt, and shrugged it off. She had no reason to feel bad. She wasn't the one who had attacked him. Leif kicked the dragon in his blue leather-clad shin, tearing a grunt from him but not shaking his hold. Blue frowned as an escape route hit him, but he was damned if he was going to mention it when Leif would think him an idiot, since he hadn't thought about it when Loki had had him pinned. Teleporting. Leif seemed to possess some sort of telepathic link to him, since he did it the second Blue thought it, disappearing from the dragon's grasp and reappearing next to Blue, his sword at the ready. "I hear word of elves in the villages, and now you appear," Loki growled low, his bright blue eyes fixed on Blue as he advanced on him. "I will not speak with you." Blue stood his ground and would have responded, but he wasn't sure that speaking was an option right now. His healing ability was kicking in, but it would be a few minutes before he could use his voice again. The dragon didn't even give him a second. The big male stormed off towards the back of the cave and disappeared into a tunnel, growling and snarling the entire time, detailing the ways he was going to kill Blue. None of them pleasant. What the hell had he done to deserve such a reception? He looked to the female, Aeneas, a hunter from Archangel. He had met her once during the battle between the third and fifth realms of the demons, when she had fought as part of Sable's team. She seemed to recognize him too as she smiled and then sighed. Sorry about that. Blue swallowed, testing his throat, and then squeaked out in English. I do not mean the female dragon harm. I simply need to ask her about something. Leif slid him a look, one that asked whether the lack of air supply to his brain had turned it to mush. He shut the mail out and focused on Aeneas, because her smile was a little too knowing, as if she was privy to all the information he was concealing with his lie, and knew why he was looking for the female dragon. Loki and Terran are close, like brother and sister. She moved away to the fire and sighed again as the male dragon roared deep in the caves, and the sound of rocks cracking apart reached them. Her blonde ponytail swayed across her back as she shook her head. He's going to be in an awful mood for days. She looked back over her shoulder at him, smiled again. You're lucky he didn't eat you. Aeneas turned back to face them. Or squash you like a bug. He knew that. He just didn't understand why the male had reacted so fiercely. He grimaced, held his throat, and forced the words out. I've never met him before. No. She shook her head again. But he has seen you, in a vision when Terran was here. He saw you. Blue frowned and inched forwards, and was on the verge of asking what the male had seen, when her blue eyes turned cold and dark. Loki saw you kill her. It took all of his will to stop himself from staggering back a step when she delivered that blow. He stared at her, sure that he must have misheard, but the coldness in her eyes didn't lift, and her expression remained somber. His blood dropped by 10 degrees, and he wanted to deny that he would do such a thing, but he couldn't as he realized his orders were to do just that. My mission is to bring her to my prince, and recover what she stole. Another lie, and another curious look from Leif that he again ignored. The sword. Aeneas raised her fine pale eyebrows. Blue cursed under his breath. She knew much more than she should, and she had just given him the best information yet. The female dragon was in possession of the weapon. Aeneas looked towards the back of the cave again, clearly listening to her mate raining unholy hell down on whatever was in the tunnels, growling and snarling, and then back at him. She whispered, I don't think Terran stole the sword. Blue's eyes widened, and then he frowned at her, not quite able to believe it even when it was exactly what his heart had needed to hear. He hadn't realized that until a sense of relief had rushed through him in the wake of her words. He wanted to look at Leif to make sure he was listening, was taking in everything Aeneas had said and was about to say, but played it cool and kept his focus on the mortal huntress. What evidence do you have to suggest otherwise? He studied her as she glanced at the back of the cave again. Her heart was pounding, and he could smell the fear on her. She was afraid her mate would hear her. Blue moved a step closer to her, regaining her attention. I witnessed the event, and her markings are unmistakable. It was definitely her. Even when he was beginning to wish it hadn't been. Not beginning, not even close. He had been wishing it for 7 centuries. Aeneas's blue eyes gained a sorrowful edge as she quietly said, What if another dragon shared those markings? A chill skated down his spine beneath his armor. Another? It wasn't possible. Markings like the ones the female bore were rare, nigh on unique. In all his centuries of hunting, he had never seen another dragon like her. He had seen white dragons and violet ones, but never a combination of 2 colors. Aeneas glanced at the back of the cave again, and her fear grew stronger, and panic lanced him. Fear she wouldn't continue when he felt so close to discovering something that might just save the female dragon's life. If you have any evidence that might clear her name, you must speak, he said, his throat aching with each word, and realized that only being honest with her would get her to talk to him now. The Elf Kingdom is on a mission to retrieve the sword, and I have orders to claim the head of the one who stole it. She gasped and whipped back to face him. No, you can't. Her blue eyes pleaded him, her fear jacking higher as she shook her head. Loki will kill you. Heck, he'll probably kill me for telling you. But from what I've heard, Terra needs all the help she can get. And if I say nothing, Her brother might destroy half of hell to set himself up as ruler of it all. Brother. Blue could only stare at Aeneas as that hit him, unable to believe what he was hearing. The seasoned soldier in him said not to believe it, that the female was lying to protect someone she viewed as a friend. Promise to help Terran, to see for yourself that she took the blame to protect her brother. Aeneas walked right up to him and grabbed hold of his wrists, squeezing them tightly as she looked up into his eyes, hers darting between his. Her twin brother. Impossible. He had never heard of dragon twins. She had to be lying. Even when the part of him he had kept silent for 7 centuries roared that she had to be telling the truth. He looked down into her blue eyes and saw the fear and hope mingling in them. He needed the dragon's destination, and he knew Aeneas would give it to him if he agreed to her request, even when he wasn't sure he could uphold any promise he made to her, no matter how fiercely he wanted to keep it. I will do all I can to uncover the one responsible for stealing the sword, and see they are brought to justice. Not quite a promise, and not a lie either. If the female dragon had stolen the sword, he would bring her to justice. It was his duty. That duty came before his desires and dreams. He only hoped that Aeneas was telling the truth, and she wasn't responsible. The Valley of the Dark Edge. That took a moment to sink in. He knew the valley, had saved Iolanthe there once, centuries ago. It was no place for a female. Thank you. He bowed his head to Aeneas and willed his portal, focusing on the stronghold in the elf kingdom when all he really wanted to do was teleport straight to the valley and the female dragon. Terran. He rolled her name around his mind, picturing her at the same time. It was strange to know it after hunting for her for so long. He appeared in the landing zone a short distance from the Pale Stone garrison, and then called his portal again, teleporting to the gates. He pushed them open and strolled into the courtyard. Dacian looked up from sharpening his blade, his broad shoulders rolling back as he sat up, revealing his bare, honed torso. He uncrossed his black leather-clad legs, planting his booted feet shoulder-width apart as he ran a glance over Blue. He tossed the stone on the bench beside him, pressed his left palm to his knee and leaned his weight on it as his violet eyes settled on Blue's neck, an unimpressed look entering them. I should have gone with you. You clearly had a better time than we did. Blue gingerly pressed his fingers to the healing bruises on his throat. If by better you mean angering a dragon and almost dying, then yes, it was tremendous fun. Leif slammed the wooden gate shut. Dacian's lips tugged into a smile, and he set his broadsword down beside him on the pale stone bench. Did the dragon work you over too? The slender elf noble shot him a black look. Did you even leave the compound? Dacian looked offended. Are you insinuating I ignored my order? It would hardly be the first time you have done such a thing. Today. Leif tensed when Dacian rose to his feet, a barely perceptible flinch that Blue would have missed if he hadn't been looking for it. If Leif's armor hadn't already been out, Blue was sure that it would have chased over his body in that instant as he readied himself for another battle with the larger elf. He bit back a sigh and stepped between Leif and Dacian before they could start fighting again. As much as he appreciated Leif having someone else to throw his barbs at, he needed them to work as a team, and that meant somehow brokering a peace treaty between them. Dacian will not break another rule, will you, Dacian? Blue straightened to his full 6'5" height and tipped his chin up, holding the larger male's gaze. He despised veiled threats, but he would do whatever it took to ensure that Dacian didn't kill Leif when he left for the valley. Alone. Dacian huffed. No. Blue turned to Leif. And of course you will not disobey an order. Leif shook his head, managing to do even that small gesture with a regal air. Never. Blue grinned. So I order you both to get along and stop acting like children. Both males shot him daggers, poisoned ones, the sort of looks that would have killed if he hadn't found them so amusing. Finn strolled out of the squat 2-story building, the open sides of his long black jacket bouncing off his trousers with each step, and stopped a few meters from them, his violet eyes leaping from Dacian to Blue and then to Leif and back again. I missed something? Leif and Dacian grumbled. "Just issuing orders," Blue said, dangerously close to smiling properly as his two finest warriors huffed and stomped around the courtyard like adolescent elves who had just been told to eat their leafy vegetables and like them. Finn's slight shoulders rolled in an easy shrug, and he crossed the courtyard to Blue. "We got some good intel. It seems offering gold, or what the dragons kept calling treasure with that weird glint in their eyes, was the way to get them talking." Blue shifted his focus away from Dacian, where he sat sharpening his sword again, a black look on his face as he glared at it, as if he was imagining cutting Leif or possibly him down with it, to the younger elf. "What did they have to say?" "A few talked. They certainly have no love for the dragon we're hunting, and it was definitely her home once." Finn hooked his thumbs over the waist of his black trousers, pushing them low on his bare hips and revealing a hint of the tattoo on his left one. A few of the elves under his direct command at the castle had taken to inking their skin with the insignia of their legion. Most soldiers chose a discreet size and location. Dacian had the intricate design of dragons and stags spanning his broad back, a sign of his devotion to the legion he called his family. "They called her, Terran," Finn said with a frown, as if he didn't quite trust he had her name right, and Blue resisted the temptation to confirm that he was correct, but also found it interesting that the dragons had sold out one of their own in exchange for gold, when they had been so fiercely protective of her before. Finn stole his attention away from the odd behavior of their species. "Some mentioned family, a sibling. When we tried to get information on that sibling, the dragons clammed up and wouldn't talk." A sibling. The twin brother, if Aeneas was correct. "Not even for more gold." Blue looked from Finn to Dacian. Both elves shook their head. "They got jittery." Dacian set his sword back down. So the dragons feared the brother more than they feared Terran. Blue nodded. "We have a location where we might find her. I will go ahead and scout the valley and—" "What?" All three males spoke in unison, cutting him off. He knew that he sounded as if he had lost his mind. The sensible course of action was to take everyone with him as backup, and he didn't exactly look as if he was up for the task of a solo mission when his throat was still black and blue from an encounter with another dragon. But he had to go alone. Blue held his hand up to silence them before they could unleash the barrage of objections he could see coming from a league away. "Is this because of what the mortal female told us about the female dragon's brother being the one responsible?" Leif said anyway, obviously intent on ignoring at least one command today to get himself on even footing with Dacian and Finn, knowing Blue would have to let it slide. He nodded. "It is. And as commander of the legions, I have to scout the valley and see if that intel is correct. It won't confirm whether or not the female is innocent, or that the two of them aren't working together, but it is information that requires investigation." "Then we should go with you. It will be quicker for 4 to scout the valley." Dacian stood, unfurling his 6'7" frame and standing tall, every muscle on his bare chest flexing as he clenched his fists at his sides. "And more obvious," Blue countered. "It is easier for one lone male to move around the valley undetected. I will go alone. Do not worry, Dacian, I will not engage the enemy." Dacian grumbled something under his breath and looked close to either huffing or voicing another objection. Blue couldn't tell which it would be, but he appreciated the male's concern and knew it had nothing to do with the threat of potentially missing out on a fight, and everything to do with how dangerous it was for Blue to go alone. Dacian wanted to be there to protect him and have his back. "Leif," he turned to the slighter male. "Report to Prince Lauren what we have discovered." Leif looked as if he wanted to protest, but held his tongue and nodded. Blue looked at each of them in turn. "Make preparations and continue investigating the dragon realm as a team, in case the dragon has moved on and the valley is a dead end. I will return soon." He waited for all three males to press their right hands to their chests before focusing on the dragon realm and willing his teleport. The colorful light traced over his body, and the darkness welcomed him, a brief rush of cold before it dissipated to reveal a black valley stretching before him. He settled his gaze on the small village at the center of it far below him, and then looked beyond the settlement to the mountains that loomed there, rising into the grim gray sky. Wind battered him, warmed by the lands to his right, where the Devil's Domain spewed lava that caused an orange haze above the peaks of the cragged mountains. His eyes remained locked on the range directly in front of him, across the valley from the mountain where he stood. Beyond those sharp peaks was the valley Aeneas had spoken of, one where he might find the dragon he had been hunting for 7 centuries. Had he been chasing the wrong dragon all this time? Blue drew down a deep breath, held it for a second, and exhaled slowly. He hated lying to his team, battering the trust they shared, but he hadn't had a choice. They would never have consented to his plan if they had been here with him and had realized what he had in mind. Not merely scouting the valley. He meant to speak with the female dragon. He felt certain that he could talk with her without her attacking him. Insanity, but every instinct he possessed roared that he could, drowning out the doubts that constantly whispered that she had attacked him before. He'd had her backed into a corner that time. She had been speaking with him, calm and collected, and then he had advanced on her and she had felt threatened, lashing out to defend herself. This time, he would let her feel in control, that she had all the power and he wasn't a threat to her. He would keep his distance as he should have 3 centuries ago. He would make her feel safe. He would make her speak with him and tell him the truth. A truth he needed to know, because he was tired of denying the one he knew deep in his soul. It was time they both stopped running. Chapter 15. Taryn didn't even have the energy to yawn. She sat on the end of her double bed, hands curled over the edge of the mattress next to her thighs, her eyes fixed on the black wall opposite her, vision hazy. It was all she could do to breathe. Every bone in her body felt heavy, as if someone had poured lead into her marrow. Her mind ached, her heart throbbed, the weariness trickling through her veins like sludge that clogged her up and pulled her down until she was drowning in it. Gods. The dragon she had loved was gone, and the one wearing his skin was a stranger to her. That feeling had been growing inside her for the past few days, and it had seized hold of her heart, sinking poisoned talons into the soft, vulnerable flesh. Loki was right. Her brother was gone. His lust for power had corrupted him, the darkness seducing him with an obsession with possessing all the realms in hell, clouding his vision and making him view them as the ultimate treasure a dragon could hold. It was madness. She tensed as a harrowed scream echoed around the castle, chilling her blood. Her fingers twitched, and then she was rubbing her arms before she could stop herself, trying to scrub off the guilt and the fear. Those terrified cries were her fault. She had caught Tenak chasing a fey male across the valley yesterday morning, toying with him by letting him break a short distance ahead of him before swooping on him, knocking him to the black earth. It had been too cruel, and she hadn't been able to stand by and watch the hope reigniting in the poor creature, as he found his feet and began running, only to be shattered all over again when Tenak pounced on him. She was too familiar with such feelings. How many times had she experienced the same fleeting burst of hope, like a warm light touching her soul and chasing the darkness back for a few short minutes or hours, before the darkness crashed back over it and destroyed the light? Too many times, and each had been more painful than the last, stripping another piece of her soul away. She had stopped her brother, but he had demanded a reason for her intervention, and she had blurted the first thing that had come to her. She had told him to place the male in the cells instead, so they might have some entertainment, and she could watch one of his kind suffer as she had. Gods, she had meant to spare the male more pain, finding a way to allow him to escape. But Tenak had found a startling new way of passing his time, one that had kept her shut in her room, afraid of leaving it, trapped by her memories and fear of what she might see. It would break her, she knew that much. Tenak had discovered a lust for torture, now spent most of his time down there in the dungeon inflicting terrible pain on the fey male and the others he had captured. She shuddered, unable to stop the chill from racking her tired body, when she recalled watching her brother from the window as he had left and when he had returned. He had become so addicted to slowly destroying his captives that he had taken to leaving the valley entirely, flying leagues to find new prey. So far, the cells contained a siren female, a nymph male, and a shifter male of some sort. Others had come and gone, killed by Tenak's overzealous attempts to make them suffer. For her. Her stomach rebelled and she clutched it. Dear gods, she couldn't think about it, but it filled her mind, flooding it with the memory of him knocking softly on her door to ask whether she was unwell. She had made the mistake of opening her door to him, and now she couldn't think about him without seeing him as he had been in that moment, standing proud with blood coating his bare chest and leather trousers, a grin curving his lips as he told her that he made them suffer for her sake. She retched, but nothing came up, her empty stomach churning with acid. She hadn't eaten in a day at least, too heartsick to find her appetite. Another scream pierced the still air, female this time. She had to fly. Taryn pushed onto her feet and her legs wobbled beneath her sudden weight, but she locked her knees and remained upright. A second shriek came, and she rushed to the door of her room and pushed it open. She marched down the corridor, haunted by the wails of agony coming from far below. They chased her, and her steps gained pace, until she was running blind, tears filling her eyes. She needed to fly. Tenak expected her in the drawing room in less than an hour, but she had time to fly before she had to listen to his sick and twisted plans for the inhabitants of this realm, and pretend that they pleased her when all she wanted to do was plunge a dagger into her brother's blackened heart. Ahead of her, the thick doors of the fortress were closed for once, as if Tenak wanted to make sure none of his prizes escaped, including her. She hit those doors at a dead run, barging them open and knocking one side off its hinges. Splinters pierced her shoulder and upper arm, but she didn't feel the pain as she shifted, her scales pushing the fragments of wood from her flesh. She beat her wings the second they were free and launched into the air, filled with a frantic need to feel the wind on her face and soar high above the world, so high that she couldn't see the horrors it contained, the cruelty and madness. She would fly so high that all she would know was peace at last, and hell would look beautiful again. Taryn beat her wings and soared upwards, her heart steadying as she gained height and left the castle behind her, no longer feeling as if she was being chased. She breathed deep and spread her wings, focused on the feel of the wind on their white membranes and the subtle shifts in the air currents. She tipped her head and chest up and caught one thermal, used it to lazily circle higher in the air until the world below dropped away and silence reigned. The lands of the dragons and the devil stretched far below her, the villages only specks on the black ground. In the distance, far from the devil's realm, at the opposite side of hell, the elf realm was hazy gold, a beacon that called to her. Was he there, waiting for her, searching for her? She glided across the width of the valley and swooped lower, the sensation of peace growing stronger, flowing through her and calming her. It even restored some of her strength. She let it roll over her and savored it, embraced and nurtured it, afraid it would go away too soon when she wanted the feeling to stay. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so at peace, so unafraid. Flying had never made her feel this way before. It had only ever satisfied her urge to feel free, the compulsion to fly and spread her wings, and know that she was no longer shackled and enslaved. What was different today? She banked left, swooping towards the black citadel where it rose out of the mountain, and shooting past it, turning at the last second to evade a collision with it. The sense of peace flickered for a heartbeat, wavering like a candle in the wind as she neared the castle, and gaining strength again as she flew away from it. It continued to grow as she beat her wings and headed towards the dragon realm, easing away her fear and imbuing her with strength. Odd. She studied the sensation, unable to make sense of it. It ran deep, as deep as her blood or maybe deeper still, and it was strangely familiar, as if she had experienced it before. Maybe she had. Being around her brother had made her feel safe and calm when she had been younger. Was that the sensation she was recalling? She hadn't felt that way in many centuries, though, and for some reason it didn't seem like the right answer. She scanned the horizon, convinced and afraid that Loki had foolishly tracked her down. He had always made her feel safe, And he knew where she had gone because he had been the one to give her Tenak's location. Her sharp gaze caught on movement and darted there. Her breath left her in a dizzying rush, and she almost forgot to keep beating her wings. Her heart plunged as if she had and was falling. The feeling she had been having suddenly made terrifying sense. The small black-clad figure on the mountainside slowly lifted their head, revealing a gap in their ornate black helmet, little more than an open strip across their eyes. Eyes that seemed to pierce her soul and set her blood on fire as they locked on her. The elf male. Chapter 16. Blue traversed the rocky black ground, watching his footing as he moved silently and swiftly between boulders, switching his vantage point to get a different view of the valley. It looked quiet. He hunkered down behind an outcrop of rock and scanned the valley basin, picking out enormous bones and gnarled black trees. No sign of life, though. He quickly glanced over the entire valley, from the mountain ranges that reached along it on the left and right to the far end. Satisfied that no one could see him, he set his gaze on a fissure in a mountain on the right side, one halfway along the length of the valley, and teleported there. He landed silently and immediately crouched behind another boulder, keeping still as he scoured the valley from the new angle. His gaze caught on a citadel far to his right, at the end of the valley furthest from the dragon realm. Black jagged spires rose from the mountain, as if someone had carved it out of the great peak. The female had to be there. With the sword? And the brother? One dragon was dangerous enough, easily able to kill him. Two didn't bear thinking about. His pointed ears twitched as a cry echoed from the castle, muffled by the layers of rock but loud enough to reach him. His armored claws tensed against the boulder, and he had to dig them in to keep himself in place and stop himself from teleporting straight to the castle, obeying the primal part of him that roared that it was his mate screaming. Blue breathed deep, hoping to settle the powerful urge and stop it from happening again. Impossible. Now that he had admitted that the female dragon was his Kiara, casting aside the conditioning that had made him forget her, the instincts as her male were awakening. Gods, he couldn't let them control him. He had to remain objective about everything, including the female. If he allowed his instincts to rule him, he might walk right into a trap or march straight to his death. Or worse, he might allow her to use the sword to destroy half of hell. He wouldn't be the first male duped into committing atrocious acts by his fated female, blinded by his primal instincts, controlled by them and an overwhelming need to please her at any cost. He closed his eyes and bent his head, focused on his breathing and recited his mission in his mind, until it cleared and the female was nothing more than an objective again. He would speak with her somehow, and if she were a threat to the realm and everyone in it, he would eliminate her as ordered. Blue leaned his right side against the black boulder, his armor allowing him to blend into his surroundings in the low light. The slats covering the lower half of his face caused his warm breath to bounce back at him, and his horned helmet trapped heat. He ached to remove his helmet, but blending into the landscape to avoid detection was more important than how hot and sweaty it made him. How stifling it was as he tried to breathe. He couldn't breathe. Fuck, what was he doing? He looked across the dead valley to the castle, felt that question right to the pit of his soul. What had possessed him to come here alone and made him believe that he could speak with the female? She was his mate, but she was his mission first and foremost. He couldn't allow his instincts as her fated male to corrupt him or sway him from that mission. They were only instincts. He felt nothing for her, not a single drop of emotion. She was a mission. A shadow loomed out of the gloom, a flash of white and violet, and his breath caught in the back of his bruised throat as he tipped his head back and watched the dragon rush straight overhead. Enormous wings beat the hot air, sending it thundering down the mountainside and stirring an avalanche of dust that swept past him. He didn't notice it as he watched the dragon, unable to take his eyes off it, off her. Those primal instincts fired, told him that the beast flying away from him, swaying at an angle in the air as she spread her wings wide and skimmed the side of the mountain range, following it back towards the castle, was his mate, his Kiara. And holy fuck, she stole his breath away. His gaze followed her as she banked around, her long tail curving to assist her in the turn, and white wings lazily beating the air, making it look as if flying was an effortless task. Her white horns almost brushed the violet scales of her neck as she twisted her head, tipped it back at the same time as she flapped her wings, and his heart gave a hard thump as she barely missed the castle's spires. She turned, swooped lower, and then rose higher on a single beat of her wings, heading towards his end of the valley. Her head barely moved as she looked around, large eyes taking everything in. Her talons flexed, and she tucked her front legs up as she gained height, pulling them close to her white chest. He lost himself in watching her. Majestic, beautiful. He had never seen those two qualities in dragons. Not as many in hell did, but he saw them in her. Huge violet eyes dropped, landed right on him. The thought that it was impossible she had seen him against the black rock when his armor covered all but his eyes didn't even have time to form in his mind before strange heat flooded him, followed by a surge of images pulled straight from his dreams of her. A disjointed vision of kissing her, wrapping her up in his arms as he possessed her, claimed her. The mountain shook as she landed hard on the slope below him. She slammed her paws into it, sharp, dark violet talons sinking straight into the rock as she clawed her way up the steep incline at speed, coming straight at him. She snapped and snarled, flashing white fangs each as long as his arms. Blue held his ground, his years as a soldier combining with his primal instincts to tell him that she didn't mean him any harm. She meant to drive him away. It wasn't going to happen. He had come here to speak with her, and he was going to do just that. "Return the sword," he said in the dragon tongue, and rose onto his feet, moving slowly so he didn't spook her. She growled and lunged at him, snapped her jaws together just inches from his face, close enough that his portal flickered over his armor, survival instinct bringing it to the fore without him even thinking about using it. He exhaled slowly, calming himself again. She snarled, her reptilian jowls rippling with the odd sound, her fangs mere feet from him and filling his vision. She inched closer, and the fierce points of her teeth parted enough that she could easily snap them closed over him before he could escape. But she didn't. She remained there, growling so loud that it was deafening, still trying to scare him away, not serious about fighting him. Why? In this form, she could easily crush him. She could eat him whole. It didn't make any sense, but he would roll with it. He didn't mind being right and coming away from their meeting with his life. As casually as he could manage, given the proximity of her fangs, he leaned his right hip against the boulder and issued a mental command to his armor. The slats covering his face shifted back, sliding under each other until they had cleared his cheeks, and his helmet deconstructed itself, the dragon-like horns shrinking and scales rippling down to join the rest of his armor. The female edged back, enormous eyes following the transformation. Her elliptical pupils narrowed and she canted her head to one side a fraction of a degree before she jerked it back straight and growled at him again. He had the impression he had just been blamed for something. Distracting her? If it would distract her enough to get her to shift into her mortal form, he would strip naked. His body got the wrong idea about that, blood rushing south. He gritted his teeth and focused on her and his mission. She was just a mission to him. His head didn't seem to be listening to him, because it started throwing flashbacks of his dreams at him, hot and sweaty visions of them tangled together, naked and lost in passion. Blue closed his eyes, blew out his breath as he sought some balance again, reciting his mission orders and the reason he was here to purge the images from his rebellious mind. Or was that his heart? It would be typical of the damned thing to slip its leash now, when it was imperative that he remain detached and in control. He opened his eyes, settling them straight on hers, the source of his problem and his damned objective in this mission. She jerked back and flashed fangs at him, snarling low in her throat. She didn't like it when he pinned blame on her. Well, it was her fault for distracting him with nothing more than her presence, her sweet proximity. It was playing havoc with him. He barely resisted the urge to fold his arms across his chest, catching himself at the last second. He was here to speak with her, and adopting a threatening pose was a surefire way of stopping that from happening. She had to feel in control. Her eyes followed his right hand as he lifted it and touched the left side of his throat. The scales of his armor cooled beneath his fingertips. The scars on it tingled, a reminder of what she could do in her mortal form when she felt cornered. He didn't want to imagine what she might do if she felt cornered when in her dragon one. Her eyes narrowed and she backed off, even glanced away from him. Guilty? Did she feel bad about what she had done? He stared at her, letting that sink in, studying her and seeing in her behavior that she did feel guilty. It strengthened his hope that he had the wrong dragon, because if she had slaughtered thousands of elves as the kingdom believed, she wouldn't have felt a damn thing about clawing one and leaving him scarred. If you return the sword and come with me, there is a chance I can convince my prince to be lenient on you, he said in her tongue, and wrestled with the urge to say more, to somehow make her come with him and leave this valley of death behind her. And gods, it had nothing to do with fulfilling his damned mission. She shifted back right before his eyes, transforming into a female who robbed him of his breath, had stolen it the first time he had set eyes on her and every time after that. Silky hair fell to just below her shoulders, deep violet at its roots, but pure snow white where it brushed her chest. He curled his fingers into fists, fighting the desire that surged through him and his need to drop his gaze to her bare body and take in every perfect inch of her. Sweet gods, she was perfect. Despite his efforts and keeping his eyes locked on her face, carnal hunger flooded him. His ears flared back against the sides of his head and his vision sharpened, a response to the desire now rushing through him like a tidal wave, obliterating all sensible thought, destroying everything in its path until his entire body came alive with the need to have her. His fangs lengthened, and he itched with a need to reach out, grab her slender wrist and pull her into his arms. He needed to kiss her until she melted against him, moaning his name as he burned her resistance away. No good could come of that. Blue slowly clawed back his sanity and closed his eyes, shutting her out as he tried to piece himself back together and remember his place, and hers. Until she had proven that she hadn't stolen the sword, she was his enemy, and he had to bring her to justice for her crimes. It was his mission, his purpose. He opened his eyes and stared at her, finding her still watching him, her violet to white gaze steady. So why couldn't he bring himself to fight her and take her into custody? Why the hell was he bent on being diplomatic when he had always sucked at diplomacy? He had been born to find peace through battle, not through words. He wasn't Lauren. Her eyes narrowed on him, ran down the length of him, and set his body on fire again. Gods damn her. He wanted to growl whenever she looked at him like that, had to fight to restrain himself when all he ached to do was step into her, draw her flush against the body she was checking out, and show her just what his armor concealed, pressing every hard inch of him into her. He bit out a curse in the elf tongue instead and reeled that hunger in, and cursed every mated male he knew while he was at it. Suddenly he pitied the poor bastards. When he had watched them fawning over their fated one, acting like pricks, he had thought them ridiculous, lacking strength and self-control. He had been convinced they had allowed the pull of their mate to overcome them. He was painfully aware now that it hadn't been the case. There was no fighting this. There was only clawing together enough control to keep himself sane and stop himself from acting on every primal instinct that screamed at him to take his female into his arms and bend her to his will. Clothes molded over her body, violet leather covering her long legs and a creamy white corset covering her torso, and matching pale bands closing over her forearms. The hunger he felt abated enough that he could think straight again, and part of him wanted to thank her for having the decency to put him out of his misery by covering herself. Blue stared at her, taking her in, recalling all their past meetings and how she had looked then, and comparing it to how she appeared now. At the back of his mind, the sane part of him constantly chanted that she was the enemy of his people, the target of his mission. He should be seizing her now, while he had the chance, and forcing her to return the sword. But he couldn't. He couldn't fight her. He never had been able to do it. Not from the day he had met her. Not even when she had lashed out and clawed him. He couldn't raise a hand to her in violence. Not when every fiber of him beat with the need to lift that hand and brush it across her pale cheek, as he asked her the question he really desired to voice. Was she unwell? Darkness arced beneath her striking eyes, and her skin was deathly pale, ashen almost, and she was thinner than he recalled, ravaged by either a sickness of the body or the mind. Was his female ill? The thought that she might be taken from him, almost struck him down. Blue started to lift his hand. Her eyes dropped to it, and she bared her teeth at him. He stilled. "Will you do as I ask?" he said, denying his burning need to know what had happened to her. He could find that out if he convinced her to bring him the sword, and they left the valley together. "No." Her voice was pure light, even though she bit the word out in a harsh tone. It washed over his soul like rays of sunlight chasing over a hillside meadow, bathing it in warmth. Stupid instincts. He shut them down. She scowled at him. "Leave." Blue shook his head. "Is it true that your brother is the one responsible for stealing the sword and massacring my kin?" Her violet to white eyes widened. Her pulse accelerated in his ears. "Leave," she said, but this time her voice trembled, and he could sense the fear running through her. She wasn't afraid of him. She feared her brother, just as the dragons in the village did. "You must leave," she snapped and moved closer, her eyes gaining a desperate and wild edge as they darted between his. "Leave." "No. If you are not the one responsible, you have my word that I will speak with my prince on your behalf if you return the sword. I will see to it that the one who is responsible is brought to justice, and your name is cleared." He couldn't stop himself from edging closer, the need to be near her seizing hold of him as he felt her fear increasing. He needed to soothe her. She glanced back over her shoulder, her heart pounding in his ears now. "Leave." Her eyes were glassy when she looked back at him, her breath coming faster, soft pants that caused her chest to heave against the white leather corset. Her fear rose, swamping her delicate scent with the bitter note of it, and she whispered, "Too late." Too late. A roar rolled over the valley, rumbling around the black sky like thunder, and wind beat against him, causing the female to sway forwards, her hair whipping around her face. A huge violet and white dragon landed hard behind her, shaking the ground, and reared up onto its hind legs. Blue leaped into action, launching himself towards the female, muscles burning as he reached for her, filled with the need to pull her out of harm's way and shield her. A flicker of guilt crossed her incredible eyes, a brief flash of sorrow, and then her right hand came out of nowhere, the back of it catching him across his face. The world flew by in slow motion as he stared at her, mind numbed by one single question. Was she on her brother's side? Blue's spine hit a boulder, and he grunted as his arms flew out at his sides, and his legs kept going, the impact bending his body like a bow being drawn back. His head spun, senses swirling together and breaking apart, and he could only breathe as he struggled to piece himself back together. When his faculties were functioning again, the pain dulling to a fierce throbbing, he looked back at the female. The dragon loomed behind her, not hurting her. The look in its eyes warned that it wanted to hurt him. It snarled and lunged at him, and the female stepped into its path without hesitation, whirling so her back was to Blue, and raised her hand. Blue opened his mouth to scream at her to run, and those words fled his lips as the dragon stopped dead, its beaked snout pressed against her outstretched palm, and its massive teeth bared on a growl. Words swam in his head, spoken in her soft voice, the ringing in his ears making them impossible to decipher. The dragon eased back. Blue could only stare. She had just saved his life, which, as Sable would have said, was the biggest mindfuck of them all. He pulled himself up into a sitting position, his aching back pressed against the rock, and tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. She had saved him. She had risked her life to spare his. He wasn't sure he should be thanking her when she looked back at him, though. Her violet to white eyes dull and cold, devoid of any light. He had the sinking feeling he should be praying to his gods to save him from whatever horror awaited him. Chapter 17. Taryn couldn't shake the heat that rippled through her whenever the elf gazed at her. It had always been this way from the moment she had met him. Whenever his eyes settled on her, she was intensely aware of him. She felt it even now as she faced her brother. A shockwave of fire blasted through her, burning her up inside, making her yearn to look back at the elf male. Her gaze turned hazy as that feeling flowed through her, and she barely noticed her brother shifting back into his mortal form and clothing himself. He was nothing more than a blur of purple and cream against a fuzzy black backdrop. All of her focus was on the elf male, and on controlling the dangerous feelings rising inside her. She felt possessive of the male, and it was becoming impossible to deny the desire to cross the short span of uneven black ground to him, haul him onto his feet and kiss him, staking a claim on him. She cursed her species and her gender, aware that it was her dragon instincts that were pushing for control over her, instincts that would not only land her in trouble, but the elf too if she allowed them to seize command. Females of her kind always had trouble denying their desires, feeling them more keenly than the male of her species. Normally those males were all too happy to satisfy any female who came to them, sating their needs with no strings attached. They couldn't satisfy this hunger for her, though. No one but the male at her back could scratch this itch, and she was sure he wouldn't want to help her with it, and she couldn't allow the thought that he might to sway her. She had to remain strong, in control, even when it felt impossible. Desire ran strong in female dragon blood, but the possessive brand of desire a female dragon felt for her fated one was a powerful force of nature so potent that their history books were filled with accounts of females igniting wars, fighting legions of warriors just to get to their mate. Gods help her. She wasn't sure she was strong enough to deny that sort of need. Tenak moved towards her, and she shook as she kept her booted feet pinned to the spot, resisting the sudden urge to step into his path and stop him from reaching her fated male. She turned as her brother passed her and wanted to close her eyes, wasn't sure she was strong enough to watch what he was about to do, what she had requested he do. A growl rumbled through her as he stopped before the elf male, and every muscle in her body tensed to a painful degree as Tenak grabbed the elf by his throat and hauled him onto his feet. She silently bared her fangs at her brother's back as he shoved the elf forwards, slamming his back into the boulder, and her male grunted in pain. Pain that tore through her and had her stepping forwards, her breaths coming faster as she fought the instinct that whispered at her to protect her fated male. Tenak muttered black things about elves in the dragon tongue as he tightened his grip on the male's throat. The whispering became a roar in her mind and her heart as the elf's purple eyes slid her way, a flicker of awareness in them. She willed him not to fight her brother, to relax and let the darkness take him gently into its arms. His eyes slowly grew wild. In a sudden burst of movement, he scrabbled against the boulder, wriggling and managing to seize hold of Tenak's bare forearms. Panic flooded the male's handsome face, and she had to force herself to keep looking at him, aware that her brother would know if she looked away. She couldn't appear partial to the elf. If her brother thought she had feelings for him, he would kill the male to eliminate any competition for her affection. It hurt to deny the powerful instinct to protect the elf and watch her brother hurting him, though. The elf's eyes dulled and his struggles slowed, his fingers slipping from her brother's wrists as he tried to grasp them, each futile attempt taking more effort than the last, until his hands fell limp at his sides. Gods, she couldn't watch anymore. "Brother," she whispered softly when he showed no sign of releasing the male. "It is done." Now she would subtly manipulate her brother's actions so he would incarcerate the elf, and then she would find a way to free him from her brother's claws. Tenak didn't release the male. He raised those claws to strike him down, and she launched forwards, unable to stop herself from intervening, and caught his wrist, holding him fast even when he growled at her. "The male might have valuable information for us," she said in a gentle voice, one she had perfected during her time with her brother. He responded best when she was tender with him. It seemed to help him temper the madness that infected him, drawing him back to her. Her grip on his wrist tightened and she eased him back, away from the elf. His other hand remained locked around the male's throat. She placed her hand on that one, covering it, hoping the action would help convince him to loosen his hold, and looked up into his eyes. "I recognize the male. He is a commander from their warrior legions. We have crossed paths before." Her brother didn't look convinced. Taryn did the only thing she could to show him that she was telling him the truth. 3 centuries ago, in the Dragon Realm, our paths crossed. He questioned me about you and the sword, and I struck the male, wounding him. My claws raked over the left side of his neck," she said, and Tenak still looked skeptical. "I will prove it to you." This time, when she pulled on the hand he had around the elf's throat, he released the male and stepped back. Taryn let go of both of her brother's hands as the elf slumped to the black ground, falling on his right side. She waited until she was sure her brother was calm, and then turned and crouched beside the unconscious elf. His armor was still out. She wrestled with it, managing to wriggle her fingers beneath the collar after a few minutes' fight, and then growled as she used all of her strength to pull the tiny metal scales down. Damned armor. She hadn't thought it would be so troublesome. Her brother shifted foot to foot, his agitation flowing over her, mingling with her own as she fought the armor. What was it made from? She had never really bothered to learn much about the elves. She wanted to find whoever had created it and give them as much hell as the armor was giving her. She panted hard, heart laboring as she wrestled with the armor. It kept snapping back into place the moment she let up on the fight. If she couldn't expose his throat, and therefore that she was telling the truth about the elf, then her brother would probably kill him. Her gaze fell to the male's black-clawed fingers. She dimly recalled hearing once that elf armor was weak against its own material. The male dragon who had said it to another had been laughed out of the tavern. What if it was true, though? She glanced up at her brother, finding him standing close to her, eyes pinned on the male, filled with malice and dark intent. It was worth a try. She grabbed the elf's hand, wrapped her fingers around his, and began sawing at the neck of his armor with his own claws, careful to keep them away from his skin. Her eyes widened as the claws sliced through the scales. If she ever saw that male dragon again, she would tell him that he had been right. Elf armor was vulnerable to its own material. Taryn cut a line down from the side of his throat to his shoulder and released his hand, letting it drop to the ground again. She peeled the black metal scales away from his skin and slowed as they revealed not perfect skin but dark bruises, some of which had already changed color to show they were healing. Her brother hadn't caused these marks. Someone else had tried to strangle the elf recently. Who? Her eyebrows knitted together, and her heart pounded harder as she stared at the deep bruising, her hands shaking as a need to find whoever had hurt the male and make them suffer surged through her. It was little wonder the male had become panicked so quickly when her brother had caught hold of his throat. Gods, what had she done? She had asked her brother to render him unconscious but not harm him. She had known he would choose to suffocate the male, a surefire way of sending him into the waiting arms of darkness without inflicting great injuries. She looked down at the male where he lay at her side, his face slack and lips parted, strands of his blue-black hair brushing his brow. She wanted to sweep those strands away, ached to flutter her fingers over his sculpted cheek and apologize for what she had done. She hadn't known what he had suffered recently. She had only thought of saving him. She felt her brother's eyes on her, sensed that she was taking too long and he was growing impatient and suspicious of her. She forced herself to sit back so her brother could see the 3 jagged scars that ran over the elf's neck. She couldn't resist touching them, placing the fingers she had used to create them against the start of each line and stroking down them to his collarbone. She lifted her eyes away from the marks and up to her brother. His eyes had turned cold. "Why did you not kill the male then?" Taryn kneeled beside the elf, her fingers still against his bruised throat. His pulse beat steadily against their tips, reassuring her, and she silently swore to him that she would keep him safe and find a way to set him free. "He had other elves with him then," she said in a calm, detached tone, revealing none of her turbulent feelings to her brother, afraid Tenak would hurt the elf if she showed even an ounce of remorse or concern about his welfare. "A trio of warriors. There was no way I could have won against them, so I fled. Those elves will be with him again, I am sure of it. They will be hiding somewhere, lying in wait for their commander's return. We must question him and find their locations, so we might eradicate the threat completely." Tenak lowered his eyes to the elf, and darkness filled them. Infinite ice that warned he was thinking terrible things, horrible things. Her instincts pressed her to bare her fangs at him and warn him away from her male, and it took every shred of her will to stop herself. She couldn't obey that dark territorial urge that compelled her to attack her brother in order to protect what was hers. If she gave in to it, she would sign both hers and the elf's death warrants. Tenak shifted his gaze back to her, and she knew she hadn't won him over yet. He was still unconvinced. She had to do something more to make him do as she wanted, sparing the elf from death, and she knew what that something more was. Cold crept over her exposed skin, and she rubbed at it, running her palms and fingers up and down her arms. It didn't stop the cold. It sank deeper, grew colder, became ice in her marrow, and penetrated her heart and her soul. "They might not be alone this time," she whispered and stared off into the distance, falling into the white frigid abyss and unable to do anything but watch walls of sheer ice rise over her. She clawed at them, trying to gain a hold to stop herself, her nails digging in. Warmth bloomed beneath them, hot against her freezing fingertips. "Taryn!" Tenak barked, and the white walls shook, shattered and tumbled around her, revealing a black valley and her brother where he crouched before her. His hands were warm on her shoulders, his grip fierce. His eyes searched hers, a touch of fear in them, concern that had her following them as they fell to her arms. Blood. She stared at it, blinked. How had it gotten there? She frowned as she drew her hands away from her arms. Crimson coated her fingertips, too. It stained beneath her nails. "What were you seeing?" Tenak whispered and rubbed his thumbs across her shoulders. Fingers touching, caressing. She jerked free, scooted backwards, and bumped into something warm, something that soothed the pain that had engulfed her, making her brother's touch feel like that of a terrible fiend bent on destroying her, not someone who loved her. Taryn looked behind her at the elf male, his thighs pressed against her spine, the touch comforting, so comforting that it stripped her strength away and tears filled her eyes. "Taryn?" Tenak reached for her and she whipped her head towards him and bared her fangs. He instantly moved back, giving her the space she needed, and she settled as the sense of comfort rolled over her again, sinking harder against the elf's legs, seeking the reassurance of his touch. Tenak settled on his haunches and eyed her. "What were you seeing?" She shuddered and wrapped her arms around herself. "The arena. The black market. A few lunar cycles ago. The elf was there. He had many more men with him that time." She swallowed hard, desperate to wet her dry throat and mouth, and rubbed her arms again as a chill went through her. "There might be more this time. I did not see how many there were back then. The light from the stage, it made it—" Her throat closed and she shoved her hands into her hair, tugged it back from her face so hard that her scalp stung. "I cannot—" But she had to. The pain of her memories she could handle. She could deal with it. She wasn't sure she would be able to handle the pain of her brother killing the elf, her fated male. His death would kill her, too. She had to keep speaking, telling her brother about what she had seen. She had to convince him to go easy on the male. If she had to hurt herself to make that happen, she would do it. She would bear any pain to spare her fated male. Tenak eased forwards, recapturing her attention. Fear and agony collided inside her as she lifted her eyes to meet his, afraid of what she would find. That fear abated when she found his eyes were soft and tender, and melted away when he spoke. "We will take the male and question him. Do not think about your past anymore, sister. I ache when I see you in pain." For a moment, a heartbeat of time, he was the brother she had grown up with back at the village. But then his face darkened and his eyes turned cold. "Think about the future, my precious one, for it will be glorious." She suppressed the shudder that racked her. Glorious? Bloodshed and violence wasn't glorious. Slaughtering all who stood in the way of ruling an entire realm wasn't glorious. It was madness. The sort of insane thinking she had been exposed to and at the mercy of for 3 centuries. Her brother shifted into his dragon form. When he reached for the elf male, every instinct she possessed roared at her, and she sprang to her feet and launched into the path of his front paw. He halted, and his huge eyes moved to her and narrowed. "I will do it." That didn't seem to be explanation enough for her behavior, because she could almost feel the suspicions taking root in her brother again. His eyes narrowed further. She rushed out. "You need not sully yourself with the elf. It is beneath you to carry such cargo back to our stronghold. I will do this for you. It is my place." That seemed to appease him. He pushed back, causing rocks to tumble down the mountainside, and twisted as he beat his wings. She watched him take flight and then looked down at the elf and cursed him, wishing he hadn't been foolish enough to pursue her. Tenak roared, a command that she felt all the way to her bones. The shift was quick to come, transforming her swiftly into her dragon form. She skidded down the mountain until her huge paws found some purchase, and she was able to claw her way back up to the elf, using a few flaps of her wings to assist her. He lay where she had left him, the bruises on his throat exposed together with the scars she had given him. Taryn carefully scooped him up into her right paw, cradled him gently, and stared down at him. Tiny dragon. He had looked like one when he had been in full armor, his helmet flaring back into 2 horns and coming down into a point above his nose, and the slats covering the lower half of his face. He was as fierce as one, too, as determined, relentless in his pursuit of her. She canted her head. Did he know why he pursued her so tirelessly? Why he couldn't let her go? She wasn't sure that he did. She wasn't sure he knew that she was his mate. As she stared down at his prone form, his quiet, steady breathing loud in her ears, her strongest dragon instincts roared to the forefront, urging her to carry him far away, to a place where he would be safe. She couldn't. She could feel Tenak's steady gaze on her. He had stopped a few 100 meters away and was hovering in the air, watching her closely. She sighed, and her breath stirred the elf's dark hair. He had brought this upon himself, and all she could do was try to subtly control whatever awaited him, lessening the pain her brother would inflict on him and upon her without knowing it. She curled her paw around her fated male and cradled him close to her. Her heart warmed behind the white plates of armor that spanned her chest as she felt him press against her, and she switched all of her focus to him as she kicked off. Her wings beat at a slow pace to keep her flight smooth and avoid jostling him too much. He was cool against her, weighing nothing in her palm, but she knew he was a male whose blood was fire and body was strong. She knew he could survive whatever awaited him, and she wouldn't leave his side. She would protect him as best she could. She would find a way to set him free. Chapter 18. It stank. Wherever he was, it reeked of fetid things. Stale water, putrid blood, rancid bile. Blue groaned and breathed slowly, fighting to get air into his lungs, and not only because the foul odor robbed him of breath and made him want to retch. His already bruised and battered throat now felt as if someone had gone at it with a vice, squeezing it until his trachea had been close to breaking. His wheezing breaths only served to stir the wretched pool of filth beneath him. He mustered all of his strength, planted his palms against the cold stone floor, and pushed himself up, opening his eyes at the same time. The dim light from the wooden torch mounted on the stone wall opposite him was a mercy, giving his eyes time to adjust to being used again. He slowly took in his surroundings. One wall of metal bars in front of him and two more sets of bars on either side, those ones filling an arch. He looked behind him as much as he could without hurting his throat. That wall was solid black stone. A cell block. In the castle he had been scouting by the looks of things. No windows for him to check whether the outside world matched the valley, though. Where else would the dragon have taken him? He was surprised the male had taken him anywhere. Blue gingerly touched his throat and winced when even the slightest pressure hurt it. He needed blood to restore the strength his body was already devouring in order to speed his healing process, but he doubted he would get it here. His captor was unlikely to want to keep him strong. With every second that ticked past without him drinking blood, he grew weaker, and something told him that the male wanted that. Why hadn't the dragon killed him? A flash of the female shot across his mind, and he grimaced and clutched his head as it ached. Had she stopped him? He had caught the concern in her eyes, had felt her fear when her brother had been strangling him, and he had the feeling that he owed his life to her. She had somehow gained him a reprieve. He looked around the cell again, although he wasn't sure his situation had improved at all. He pushed his hands against the damp black flagstones and froze. Bare hands, bare arms, bare wrists. Panic lanced him and he looked over himself. Bare everything. He growled through his fangs and crawled around the cell, the rough stones biting into his knees as he scoured it for his armor bands. After an exhausting few minutes of searching, he slumped against the solid wall, breathing hard and shivering. Something wasn't right. It made sense that he would be weak from his body using his blood to speed the healing of his throat, but he shouldn't have been this weak. Blue leaned the right side of his head against the cold stones and tried to focus. He dove deep into his body, calling his portal, willing his wristbands to appear. Nothing. Perhaps the dragon had them locked somewhere his power couldn't reach. There were many ways of sealing away objects and stopping him from being able to call them. He focused on his apartments in the castle in the elf kingdom instead, and reached for something that held no power and was therefore less taxing. Trousers. A hazy connection formed, wobbled. He focused harder on it, drawing on his limited strength to reinforce the bond between him and the item of clothing. Sweat beaded on his brow and rolled down his back, cold against his exposed skin. His breath came harder, scraping in his throat. The link shattered and he slumped against the wall, his limbs like rubber. God's damn it. Blue looked himself over and his eyes halted on an innocuous red spot on his right forearm. He managed to lift his left hand and rub his thumb over it. The spot didn't go away, no matter how hard he rubbed it, and the area around it was tender. Drugged. He twisted and sank with his back against the wall. His breathing evened out, but his heart didn't steady. It continued to race, driven by fear slowly sinking its claws into him. He drew down a shuddering deep breath. The scent of blood hit him hard and his fangs itched. He suppressed his hunger, forced his fangs away, and tried to focus. He could get out of this, somehow. He tipped his head back and looked up at the ceiling, and his senses stretched outwards, covering as much ground as he could manage while he was weak. Where was the female dragon? Taryn. She had saved him. He knew it. He had lived long enough to recognize when someone had put their life on the line for him, and she had definitely risked her neck for his sake. She had been afraid of her brother, but she had somehow stopped that dangerous male from killing him. He pulled down another deep breath through his nose and closed his eyes, reaching for her. He could almost feel her moving around above him, and he could definitely smell her. He lifted his fingers to his nose and inhaled, taking the scent of her down into his lungs. She had touched him. Had she been the one to strip him? Was she in possession of his armor? He inhaled again, felt light as her scent filled his lungs, dominating the rank odor of the cells with the unique smell of her that was so out of place in this grim citadel that reeked of death. She smelled like sunshine and blue skies, and he wasn't sure how she could smell of such things when she was restricted to hell and had probably never seen the mortal world. Blue sighed and willed her to come to him, to help him out of this mess he had gotten himself into, or at least let him see her again and drink in her beauty before he died. He huffed. Idiotic thoughts. He had been in worse situations and had made it through, and this time wasn't going to be any different. He would find a way out of his cell, would escape the castle and lay low until the drugs had left his system, and then he would teleport back to the garrison and admit that he had been a fucking idiot. Gods, Leif was going to have a field day with this. He needed to investigate his surroundings before the male dragon came to see him. The bastard would come, Blue was sure of that. Drugging him and putting him in a cell wasn't the end of the male's plans for him. The way the male had looked at him, a sick, sadistic edge to his smile, had promised pain and suffering, and it wouldn't be long before he came down to deliver on that. Someone tossed a dirty rag into his cell through the bars to his right. He frowned at the scrap of black material and crawled over to it, not trusting his legs to bear his weight when his head was still fuzzy, and he was growing weaker by the second. He picked up the cloth, looked at it, and then peered into the cell beside his. The female kneeling in the center of it tensed and shrank back, dirty arms racing to cover herself. She wore similar cloth to that which she had offered him, 2 strips of it that barely covered her breasts and her hips. He thanked her with a nod and tied the scrap around his hips, covering himself. "What is your name?" he said in English, choosing a neutral language. Many in hell spoke a little of it, but his decision this time was made based on the fact that she was a fae of some sort. Most fae traveled regularly to the mortal world or lived there. "My name is Blue." She huddled into herself, her matted brown hair falling down over her face, and shook her head. Her blood-stained fingers jerkily stroked her arms, and he grimaced as he spotted that her left little finger was bent at a horrific angle, twisted backwards. The finger beside it appeared broken too. Those injuries weren't her only ones. There was barely an inch of her that wasn't bruised or cut. What sick things had the dragon male done to her? "What is your name?" he tried again, this time in the old Fey tongue, a language he hadn't spoken in millennia. She gasped, and her bloodshot golden-brown eyes shot to meet his. Tears splashed onto her cheeks, and she shuffled away from him, backing into the far corner of her cell. He had seen terrible things in his years, but nothing on this level. He had never seen a female so broken and scarred, withdrawn into herself. He left her alone, not wanting to scare her when she was already terrified. The cells beyond her were occupied too. 2 males, one alive and the other not. The gruesome remains of what had once been a male hung from chains and hooks, suspended from the ceiling. Sections of his skin peeled back to reveal muscle and bone, and stomach sliced open, guts streaming from the gaping hole. Blue blew out his breath, sucked down another one as his stomach rebelled, acid burning up his throat, and prayed to his gods that they were on his side for once, and he didn't end up like that poor bastard. He pressed a hand to his abdomen and dug his fingertips in. Shuddered. It wasn't going to happen. He wouldn't let it happen. He was going to find a way out of this mess, and he was going to make it back to his team. Leif would berate him. Dacian would give him the old "I told you so." Finn would somehow turn it all into a joke. He should have brought them with him. Together they could have fought off the dragon male and escaped. Now he was trapped here alone, and they had no clue as to his location. Leif didn't know the valley. It was painful to admit it, but he was a royal idiot for trying to do things solo. And why? Because he had wanted to protect the female. He had wanted to keep her to himself. He scrubbed a hand over his face. Gods help him. He was a bigger idiot than he had previously thought. He was the god of all idiots. Because he had been blinded by lust again, made to believe something that wasn't there. She was his fated female, and he wanted to believe she felt something for him. But his current situation was making it hard to believe anything other than that she had stopped her brother from killing him for some nefarious reason. It smelled of her down here. She had been in the cell block, and his gut said it had happened more than once. For all he knew, she participated in torturing the poor souls trapped in the cages around him. He couldn't pretend he hadn't noticed the coldness in her eyes, the same ice and darkness that had been in her brother's when the male had been throttling him. A rumbling growl cut his train of thought short and had his head whipping towards the source of the sound. Footsteps echoed down the spiral stairwell to his left. The female in the cell to his right shrieked and curled into a tight ball, her fear washing over him. Blue didn't move. He knew what was coming, and that it was coming for him. All he could do now was prepare himself for the inevitable. He was going to find out exactly what the dragons did to their captives to turn them into broken messes. The male dragon loomed out of the darkness, golden light washing over his bare chest as he strode around the perimeter of Blue's cell, and came to a halt in front of it, near the door. His violet to white eyes locked on Blue, and Blue held them, keeping his breathing slow and his pulse steady. The male's lips quirked into a smile and then stretched into a grin. "I have the feeling you will be an interesting one." The dragon flicked a glance at the female, sighed, and looked back at Blue. "The others have disappointed me so much. They are weak. They broke easily. But you will kick your ass if you give me a few more minutes to purge this damned drug from my system." Blue growled and rose onto his feet. His legs wobbled, but he locked his knees, tensed his thighs, and refused to fall. He bared his emerging fangs at the male, his voice a thick snarl as he pushed words out through his battered throat. "You lock your victims in cages and weaken them before you dare set foot in them. You want interesting? I will show you interesting. Just a little blood and a few minutes, and I will show you how weak you are." The dragon launched at the bars of his cell, hands slamming into them and rattling them. Blue held his ground, calmly holding the dragon's gaze as stone dust rained down from the points where the metal bars met the ceiling. The male was strong, but easy to antagonize. Prince Lauren's voice rang around Blue's head, a montage of the 1,000,001 times he had told him not to antagonize his opponents. It never stopped him from doing it. An angry and frustrated enemy was an enemy who was ruled by their emotions, unable to think clearly. It was an advantage, and Blue loved to take it. "You think yourself strong?" The male pulled a set of keys from his pocket, slid one into the lock on his cell door, and twisted it. The door creaked open and the dragon stalked into it, his eyes narrowed and fury rolling off him. He tilted his head, cracking his neck, and rolled his shoulders, and then slammed the door closed behind him. "I will show you how weak you are." Blue ducked under the fist that came at his face and tried to evade the one aimed at his stomach, but wasn't quick enough. It struck hard, knocking the wind from him and lifting him off his feet. He grunted and wheezed, and then growled as he tasted blood. He had said to give him 5 minutes, hadn't he? The bastard wasn't going to prove anything by fighting him right now, while he was weakened by drugs. Well, he wasn't going to prove anything other than he was a pathetic male who knew he couldn't win a fair fight, so resorted to nefarious means to bring down an opponent. Blue spat blood in his face and swung at him. The male dodged backwards and Blue followed through. The motion sent him off balance and he staggered right, tripped on his own damn feet, and hit the black flagstones with jarring force, grunting again as he struck them. "Pathetic." The dragon grabbed him by the back of his neck and dragged him onto his feet. "Funny," he rasped, paused when he sounded groggy, and shook his head to clear it of the fuzziness that was already encroaching around the edges of his mind, and flashed bloodied teeth at the male in a grin. "My thoughts exactly." The stone wall greeted Blue's back with a fierce embrace, and he barely stopped himself from crying out as every bone in his body ached from the blow, fire zinging along them and numbing his fingertips. His knees gave out, but the dragon grabbed him by the throat before he could hit the floor, hauling him off his feet and pinning him to the wall. Someone else had done that to him once, and it hadn't gone down well then, and it damned well didn't go down well now. He brought his right leg up and slammed it hard between the dragon's violet leather-clad thighs. The male grunted, dropped him, and staggered back, clutching at his groin. Blue's feet hit the floor and his legs almost gave out, but he remained standing. Progress. He flexed his fingers, testing his body's responsiveness. It was improving. Just a few more minutes and he would be strong enough to show this male that he had picked a fight with the wrong elf. The male lifted his head and slowly released his crotch and rose to his full height. Violet fire flashed in his eyes as he rolled his shoulders back, and his honed bare broad torso tensed as he growled. The fingers of Blue's left hand twitched, and he focused on them and the link between him and his blade, willing it to come to him. The dragon looked down at his hand and then up into his eyes and hissed at him. He moved faster than Blue could track, snatching his left arm and twisting it behind his back, shoving his hand up his spine so far that his elbow snapped. He bit down on his tongue to stop himself from crying out, and breathed through the pain as his cheek and chest slammed into the cold stone wall, the dragon's powerful body pinning him against it. "You will scream for me," the dragon snarled into his ear, breath hot on Blue's cheek, and pressed him harder against the wall as he twisted his arm at an excruciating angle. "You will scream for her." Her. That word pierced his pain-fogged mind. Taryn. A part of him reached out to her in response to her name whispered in his skull, seeking her, desperate to feel her. The dragon sank claws into the back of his neck and yanked him away from the wall, spun him around and slammed a fist into his face. He lashed out with his right hand, trying to shove the male away, to gain enough space and time to stop his head from spinning and find his feet again. The male didn't let up. He grabbed Blue's throat and punched him harder, pummeling his face. "Scream!" the dragon bit out. Blue refused. He gritted his teeth and didn't make a sound as the male worked him over, not even when he switched to hitting him in the kidney and then his stomach, not even when he kneed him between the thighs, not even when he raked claws down his bare chest and slashed up his back. He wouldn't give the male the satisfaction of hearing him scream. Time blurred, the pain stealing focus from him, so his tentative connection with the female slipped away beyond his reach. The world turned red, hazy with blood as it streamed over his face from the cuts where the male had clawed at his skull, holding the top of his head as he had slashed talons over his flesh, cutting through his muscles and scraping over his bones. Hot liquid dripped down onto his chest, seared the lacerations on it, and everything became streaked with bright colors before it all turned monochrome. Spots of color came back, red of blood, violet, startlingly vivid against the black and grays. The male shoved him aside and Blue skidded on the pool of his own blood that now coated the black stones, and landed in a heap in the center of it. The dragon towered over him, bloodied chest heaving, eyes burning with violet fire. He held his hand up, a small empty vial held between his thumb and index finger, the source of the flames that had licked across Blue's wounds and caught his blood alight, and grinned viciously. "Let us see how you fare now, warrior." Those words seemed to shimmer in the air before the dragon, twisted and echoed in Blue's ears as he struggled against the white-hot fire running through his blood, burning it up. Blue tried to focus on the male, but he wobbled and distorted, blurred one moment and painfully sharp the next. He sat on his knees, arms limp and useless at his sides, pain and the drug numbing him but setting him on fire at the same time. His fangs itched, the scent of blood driving him mad with hunger. Darkness rose in response to that hunger, transforming it into a terrible craving that he couldn't deny. It consumed him, devouring his strength, tearing down his control until he could think of only one thing: blood. He narrowed his eyes on the dragon's carotid, launched at him with fangs bared. The male backhanded him and he shot across the cell and hit the cold metal bars. Lightning sizzled across his mind, jagged tendrils reaching over his skull, and he slid down the bars to the ground, the world around him spinning. When it finally stopped, the dragon male was gone and the door to his cell was open. Blue frowned at it and then clawed at the ground, slipping the fingers of his right hand into the cracks between the flagstones and growling as he dragged himself towards it. He had barely moved a few inches before the male was there in the doorway. He wasn't alone. The dark-haired female he held by the back of her neck struggled like a wild thing in his grip, screaming and lashing out with her arms and legs. "You are not allowed to die yet," the dragon snarled, and Blue looked between him and the female, struggling to focus on either of them as his strength ebbed away, and the roar for blood grew deafening in his ears. "You die once you have paid for chasing my sister. You die once she has witnessed your punishment and gives you leave to do so. Now, we will make you strong again." Blue's eyes slowly widened as the female the dragon held stilled and looked at him, her golden eyes enormous and her skin washing of color beneath the dried blood and dirt. He tried to speak, fought to find his voice and tell the dragon not to do it, because the darkness running in his veins was too strong, the hunger too fierce to deny. She started to shake her head. The dragon hurled her at Blue and he pounced on her, taking her down to the ground and sinking his aching fangs into her neck. Blood burst onto his tongue, and he moaned low in his parched throat as he gulped it down, a slave to his hunger as it hijacked control of him. A dim and distant part of him told him to stop, but he crushed that voice and sank his fangs deeper into her flesh, relished her cry as she clawed at him, fighting him and causing his teeth to tear ragged holes in her. He frantically lapped at the blood she spilled, desperate for it all, unwilling to waste a single drop. He needed it. He snarled as someone moved on the periphery of his senses, dragged the female closer to him so they couldn't take her from him, and bit her again. She jerked in his arms and screamed, her warm, sweet blood filling his mouth, feeding the darkness that flowed through him, swirling deeper to wrap black thorny tendrils around his mind and his soul. They tightened their hold as he drank deeper, greedily gulping down her blood. "Feed," a male voice murmured. Blue did so, too hungry to stop now that he had started, and part of him silently hoping that if he obeyed the male, he would give him another to drink from, once this one was dead. Chapter 19. Taryn rushed from her room and hit the hallway at a sprint. Breath sawed from her lips and burned in her lungs, and her heart beat painfully hard. It leaped into her throat when the agonized bellow came again, joined by a more feminine shriek of terror this time. The elf. She bolted down to the next level and pushed herself harder, cursing herself for leaving Tenak's side for even a heartbeat. She should have remained with him at all times, but she had needed a moment to breathe and pull herself together. Her brother had taken advantage of that, venturing down to the cell block alone when he had sworn he would wait for her. She cursed him, too. Another chilling, high-pitched scream tore through the black castle. Gods, what was her brother doing to her fated male? The closer she came to the dungeon entrance, the stronger the sensations running through her became, the clearer they grew, until she could feel the male's pain and suffering and the violence that filled him, the darkness. She banged her right shoulder on the stone doorframe, winced and pushed on, hurrying down the spiral steps. As she neared the dungeon, she managed to rein back enough control to slow her steps. She slowed her breathing, too, fighting the instincts running rampant through her, demanding she reach her male and protect him from whatever wretched thing her brother had in mind for him. The pain flowing through her grew stronger still, until it beat at her and she trembled. Such suffering. It chilled her blood and she rubbed her arms, desperate to warm herself and shake the images that clouded her mind, tormenting her, a vision of what her beloved brother had done to her fated one. She had seen the sorts of acts her brother committed in this cell block, and as much as she wanted to push away from the images of her male suffering the same fate, she forced herself to let them wash over her, using them to prepare herself for what awaited her. Her steps slowed further still, until she was barely moving as she wrestled with her feelings and her instincts, trying to bring them under control. She couldn't fly into the cell block as she wanted and tear into her brother. She had to keep playing the role she had undertaken and see it through to the end, and that meant ensuring her brother still thought she was on his side, as mad with a hunger for power and vengeance as he was. It was hard, though. She stopped on the stairs as her legs weakened and wobbled beneath her, the elf's pain so strong that it crashed over her, threatening to send her to her knees. She shot her hands out on both sides, pressing them into the damp walls in the narrow stairwell, and breathed through it. When her heart had steadied again and her instincts no longer ruled her, she pressed forwards, prepared to face what awaited her, and do all she could to stop the elf's suffering. Taryn took the remaining few steps down to the dungeon and turned her head to the right, fixing her focus straight on the cell beside her. On the elf male in the middle of it, stripped bare and snarling as he savagely fed from a fey female. Gods, she had been wrong. She wasn't prepared at all. Her breath left her in a rasping rush and she staggered backwards, her bottom hitting the wall. The elf lifted his head and her knees almost gave out. Blood and gore drenched the lower half of his face and coated his chest, and his fangs were long white daggers between crimson lips as he stared at her, a glassy quality to his violet eyes as they leaped straight to her. He growled and looked away from her, still for a moment, a heartbeat of time that made her want to reach out to him and tell him to stop, sure that she could get through to him even when he was so far gone, lost to the darkness she could feel in him. He sank his fangs back into the female another second later, a feral snarl peeling from his lips as he bit her. She cried out, the sound feeble and weak now, and Taryn shifted her focus to her. Her pulse was weak. The elf was going to kill her if Taryn didn't do something. She dragged her eyes away from the male and turned towards the bend in the corridor that would lead her around to where her brother stood in front of the elf's cell. The female screamed again, a gurgled sound that sent a cold wave through Taryn. Her vision distorted and she gripped the wall for support, breathing hard and fast again as memories rose up to seize hold of her and drag her down into them. Her skin crawled, icy fingers dancing across it, touching, caressing, threatening to sink their claws in and tear her sanity away. Taryn swallowed the bile that rose into her throat and pushed forwards, forcing her feet to move. She couldn't lose her mind now. She had to reach her brother. She turned the corner and lifted her head, and her eyes caught on his hand. His fingers clutched a small glass vial. Tenak had given the elf a hallucinogenic drug that dragons used on the eve of battle to stir their strength and hunger for the fight, and destroy any fears they might have. Those dragons took it in powdered form because it was slower to enter the bloodstream and the effects were drawn out. In liquid form, the drug was swift to enter the blood, the effect of it hitting the user in a devastating rush that had been known to destroy the mind of even the strongest dragons. Taryn stared at the vial. Her brother had given the drug to the elf as a liquid, and she couldn't imagine what it had done to him. She looked across at the male as she approached her brother. Her breathing came quicker again, flashes of her past overlaying onto the present, flickers of all the cages she had seen and all the poor souls they had contained. Agony rolled through her, cold and hot at the same time, tearing down her strength, and she sank into her memories, unable to claw her way to freedom as she stared at the elf male. Caged, forced to do things against his will. She wrapped her arms around herself and pressed her nails into her flesh, using the pain to anchor her in the present. It wouldn't last forever. The trick would give her a few minutes at best before the memories regained control and she slipped away again, drowning in them. A few minutes in which she had to watch her male as he suffered. Gods, part of her wanted to sink into her memories to escape the terrible sight. The rest of her demanded she stay lucid and do something. She looked to her brother. He watched the elf for a few seconds longer and then looked across at her, a satisfied smile on his face. She wanted to claw it off. "He will scream for you, sister. He will pay." She wanted to scream at him that she didn't want that. The elf had done nothing wrong. He didn't deserve what her brother was inflicting on him. Because of her. Tenak wanted the male to suffer as payment for hunting her. She couldn't bear that. She knew her brother couldn't see what he was doing to her, reminding her of the dark things she had survived, keeping them constantly close to the surface of her mind so they tormented her, chipping away at her sanity and leaving her feeling she was close to becoming as mad as he was. He only thought of pleasing her in his own twisted way. She looked back at the elf and closed her eyes when he bit down again, snarling as he tore at the female. What terror was he experiencing as he devoured her? Taryn could feel there was a part of him still aware of what he was doing, and she knew that when the drug wore off and he realized he had killed the female, the guilt would destroy him. He was a noble male, not a murderer. She couldn't allow him to kill the female. She couldn't let him suffer more than he had, and he would if he took the Fae's life when lost to whatever madness gripped him. The darkness. She knew enough about elves to know that many lost themselves to the darkness that lurked within them all, a part of them that they needed but feared at the same time, constantly wrestling to keep it under control. That darkness was slowly sinking its teeth into the male, but her instincts said that it hadn't consumed him yet. There was still time to save him, but she had to act now. If he killed the Fae, he would be lost forever in the black abyss. "Brother," she said, keeping the tremble of nerves from her voice and her eyes on the elf male, when Tenak looked down at her. She forced a smile, the most grotesquely twisted one she could manage, and raised her eyes to her brother. "Thank you for making him suffer. But I want to make him suffer myself. I want to savor this moment alone. You have had your time with him. Please allow me to have mine." The Fae female's heart stuttered and Taryn's palms began to sweat, her pulse kicking up a notch as she waited for her brother to respond. He stared at her for long seconds, and she almost glanced at the elf male, on the verge of screaming at her fated one to stop what he was doing before he killed the female and damned himself. "Very well," Tenak said, and she had never heard sweeter words. Relief rolled over her as her brother walked away, and she listened to him ascending the stairs, tracked him with her senses to make sure he was moving to a distance where he would be unaware of what she was about to do. The moment he had moved high into the castle, she tore the cell door open and lunged forwards. The male lifted his head and hissed through bloodied fangs at her as she reached for the Fae female. His warning rushed through her, a command to stay away from his prize that she ignored. He wouldn't kill her, but he would kill the Fae if she let this go on any longer. Taryn ripped the Fae female away from him, twisted with her and set her down near the door of the cell. Her fingers shook as she groped over the Fae's throat, searching for a pulse. It was weak, but it was there, and the relief that went through Taryn almost brought her to tears. The elf male growled behind her. It was all the warning she had before the cell spun around her and his fangs were in her throat. She whimpered as pain seared her, her head spinning from the dizzying rush of him drawing on her blood. He snarled and drew her closer, wrapping his strong arms around her and crushing her against his bloodied bare chest. It heaved against hers, pressing in hard, making it difficult for her to breathe. Her heart pounded hard and she clutched at his shoulders, tried to push him back. Her fingers slipped in all the blood, sliding off him as she fought him. He growled a warning this time, a command that she felt to the very depth of her soul. He wanted her to keep still. She couldn't. She shoved against his shoulders, panic at the helm, desperately fighting his hold on her. "Let me go," she whispered in the dragon tongue. He bit down harder and she had to clench her teeth to stop herself from crying out. She couldn't make a sound, no matter how much it hurt or how afraid she was. If her brother heard her and realized what she had done, he would kill the elf, and she would be next. "Please." She clawed at his shoulders and wriggled in his arms, and fierce fire licked down her throat as his fangs shifted, slicing through her skin. He snarled again, released her neck, and grappled with her, seizing hold of her arms. She shook her head and fought him, refusing to give in, but she wasn't strong enough. He easily pinned her arms between them, his grip on them bruising as he clutched both of her wrists together in one hand. His other hand grasped her neck, and she whimpered as his fangs sank back into her throat. He moaned. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she stared at the ceiling of the cell, her strength draining from her as rapidly as her blood as he fed deeply, suckling hard on her neck. Her vision dulled. Caged. In bars made of flesh and blood this time. She had to break free. That thought pounded through her even as her struggling slowed, her actions becoming weaker as her mind fogged. She shook in his arms, cold to the bone, no longer strong enough to fight even when she wanted to, desperately needed to break free. She needed to live, but she couldn't move as her life slipped away from her, and darkness loomed around her. A single thought swam around her head, one that chilled her and stole the last of her strength. Loki had been right. The elf would be responsible for her death. Chapter 20. Bliss. Blue floated in the darkness, lost in his hunger, drowning in it. He embraced it, caught it in his hands, drew it to his chest, and curled around it, tucking it close to his heart. Blinding light pierced the endless black, a bolt of lightning inside his mind. No, not lightning in his mind, a shaft of sunlight inside his heart. It warmed him and stirred his hunger, but brought awareness back with it. The taste of blood on his tongue, a warm body pressed against his. He had been hungry before, but the smooth, smoky sweet blood flowing down his throat now had made his thirst unquenchable. He couldn't get enough, even when a piece of him, a dim part of his mind, warned him to stop. He was hurting her. Yet the feel of her hands clutching him, clinging to him, gave him pleasure deeper than any he had ever known. A sensation of being whole for the very first time, that left him feeling he had been empty all these years, drifting through his life with part of him missing. He bit her harder and willed her to tighten her hold on him, to cling to him as fiercely as he clung to her. Her grip loosened instead. Her slender body went limp in his arms. Blue slowed his drinking, the awareness her blood had awoken in him gaining ground, driving back the darkness. He was endangering them both, but he still couldn't bring himself to stop. He didn't care. He wanted to drink her down until she was a part of him, fused with him in a way that was unbreakable. She would belong to him forever. He would never be alone again. Something screamed at the back of his mind, a jumbled wave of words that struck terror into his heart, although he didn't know why. He lapped at her blood, moaning at the taste of her. Divine. His heart faltered. He frowned and then grimaced as it missed another beat, and then began to slow, and his head felt light, his thoughts tangling together before splintering apart. The strength that had been flowing through him instantly diminished, fading away until he was trembling, barely clinging to consciousness by the bloodied tips of his claws. He needed more blood. He went to sink his fangs back into the female and stopped dead with the very tips of them touching her flesh. Her pulse beat weakly in his ears, in his chest. Her fear tainted his blood. The darkness lifted as primal instincts roared to the fore, and the words that had been jumbled before fell into order. He was killing her. Blue forced himself back and looked down at the female in his arms, her face ashen, throat ravaged. The dragon, his mate. He felt it keenly in his soul as he stared at her where she lay in his arms, her beauty stealing his breath and making him burn even as what he had done hollowed out his chest and left him cold. "Terran," he whispered as he carefully shifted her in his arms, cradling her in his left one, not feeling the pain that burned through the still healing bones, not caring about his own suffering. It meant nothing. His mate meant everything. He stroked her bloodied left cheek, brushing the backs of his fingers across it. "Terran." He willed her to wake and answer him, desperate for her to look at him and let him know that he hadn't killed her. He couldn't have killed her. "Terran," he bit out, harsher now, unable to stop the surge of darker emotions as they swept through him, unleashed by his fear that he was going to lose her. She didn't respond. His strength drained from him, hope dying with it, and he curled over her, burying his face in her fall of violet to white hair as he clung to her. Fuck, what had he done? Tears burned the backs of his eyes, and he growled into her throat, clutching her closer to him, near mad with a need to feel her warmth against him and hear her tell him that she would be fine. She wasn't going to die. Her pulse grew weaker, the timid beat echoing in his chest, affecting his own heart. His eyes widened. The bond. Gods, he had triggered it by biting her and taking her blood. Now it linked them, incomplete but powerful, entwining their bodies. He pulled back and set his jaw. He wasn't going to let her die. He refused to lose her. He placed his right hand over her heart, closed his eyes, and focused on her blood and his body, on his connection to her. The link shimmered in his blood, began to grow stronger until it burned in his veins. His head turned, the effort draining him, but he refused to stop. He didn't care if he killed himself. He only cared about saving her. In his mind, he reached out and caught the ribbon of red that now linked them, curled his fingers around it and clutched it so tightly his knuckles burned. Warmth flowed through him and he sank deep into the connection, drifting through it into Terran and using his psychic abilities to forge a stronger link between them. His strength leached away as his powers took their toll on him, but he kept pushing, using all of his will to hold the connection between them open so he could hijack control of her body. The warmth became a fire, a blaze that burned through him, and flames licked at his throat, white-hot and fierce. Blue opened his eyes and stared at the wounds on her throat as they burned on his. He turned his focus to his body, to his heart, and willed it to beat harder. He drew deep breaths, slowly and steadily filling his lungs, and gradually his pulse grew stronger, and hers grew stronger with it. His arm shook where he held her, trembling against her back as his hand quivered against her chest, pressed between her breasts. Her heartbeat gained strength beneath his palm, and in his chest, his own one fueling hers, keeping it going as he silently urged her to find her will to live again. She was strong, a dragon. Her healing abilities were on par with his. If he could keep her heart going for long enough, her body would restore enough of her lost blood to keep her alive. Lost blood. He sneered at that. Blood he had stolen from her. He had almost killed her. What kind of male did that make him? What kind of mate? He was meant to protect her, to keep her safe and never let anything bad happen to her. That was his duty as her mate, and he had failed. He had failed to protect her, but he wouldn't fail to save her. He wasn't sure how long he sat with her, the link between them held wide open by sheer force of will alone, his heart beating for hers. Everything faded until there was only Terran, lying in his arms, teetering on the brink of death. Until there was only the terrifying thought of losing her and the grim determination to stop that from happening. His strength faded as he poured all of it into saving her. The world around him dimmed, and his hand rested lax against her chest, his body no longer able to power his muscles. All he could do was sit with her resting on his lap and cling to the slender thread of the link between them. A slender thread of hope. His vision wobbled and darkness encroached. Her eyelids fluttered. Blue jerked awake and studied her face, a surge of energy blasting through him and driving the darkness back. He stared down at her, willing her to move again, to prove he hadn't been dreaming. She did one better. She moaned. "Gods, I am sorry, Kiara," he whispered in the elf tongue. The flood of emotions that crashed over him, battering him so fiercely, he shook from the onslaught. He managed to lift his hand and stroke her cheek as he stared down at her. "I am so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I swear it." Her eyes slowly opened, a frown knitting her eyebrows together. He knew she couldn't understand him, but he wasn't ready to say things in a language she knew, not when she wasn't ready to hear them, and he wasn't ready to face everything. "You tried to help me," he murmured in his own tongue, and cupped her cheek in his palm. It was cold. He rubbed it gently, trying to get some warmth back into her. "I repaid you by attacking you, and triggering this bond between us." A bond that relayed fragments of her emotions, enough that he could feel her confusion and how tired she was. Blue's fingers shook as he brushed them through her hair, carefully working the knots out from the violet roots to the blood-stained white tips. She remained relaxed against him, not fighting his hold, not even when he found the strength to curl his left hand around her arm and draw her closer to him. He cradled her, and fuck, she was beautiful as she gazed up at him. Breathtaking. He didn't deserve such a beautiful female. He averted his gaze, and it settled on the reason he didn't deserve her. Blood pooled in the gouges on the left side of her throat, where he had savagely bitten her, and steadily dripped onto the dirty, damp floor of his cell, mingling with his. He looked away from her and closed his eyes, shame riding him mercilessly, heart reproaching him. He had hurt her, damn near killed her. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the lump in his throat that refused to go away. God's damn him. His fingers tightened against her arm, and he gritted his teeth, bit out a string of curses in the elf tongue when all he really wanted to do was scream his rage until his voice gave out. He couldn't. If the dragon male heard him, he might come to see what was happening, and the male would surely kill him then. What would happen to her? Her shallow, rasping breaths filled the silence, scraping in his ears, tugging all of his fear back to the surface. He was going to lose her. He screwed his eyes shut and focused on her pulse to allay that fear, listening to her heart beating steadily. A heart he'd had to keep working through their connection. A heart that he should have cherished enough to recognize it had been his mate he had been drinking dry. Killing. His throat burned, nose stung. Eyes felt as if someone had just poured a shot of hellfire into them. His lips peeled back off his fangs as he frowned, and he ground out another curse. Trembling cool fingers touched his cheek, icy against his burning skin, and his eyes flew open only to close a second later as realization blazed through him, self-reproach following swiftly in its wake. She was trying to comfort him. The gods knew he didn't deserve it. He deserved her anger, her hatred. He didn't deserve this tenderness, this touch that came too close to affection. Her fingers dropped lower, caressed under his jaw, and he refused to obey that silent command and look at her. He couldn't. He screwed his eyes closed even tighter, and his nostrils flared as he drew down a deep breath, trying to find his feet again when the whole world had been tossed off kilter once more. Taryn refused to give him that moment, her fingers pressing against his jaw, firmer now, stronger. He could almost feel her strength returning, trickling back into her. Any moment now she was going to give him hell, and he wouldn't fight her. He would take whatever punishment she wanted to dish out, and wouldn't try to stop her when she walked away from him. He knew the score. He knew that what they shared wasn't meant to be. He wasn't the right male for her, and nothing he could do would change that. He had proven it here today, to her and to himself. She deserved better. He shifted his gaze to her and then back down to her throat. Crimson seeped from the wounds he had inflicted, so bright against her pale skin. It covered her chest and stained her cream corset, drenched the side of her face, drying dark on her skin and inner hair. Gods damn him. He didn't want to frighten her, but he couldn't leave her as she was. He couldn't deny the need to take care of her. A ridiculous need. Tending to her wasn't going to give him the result he was looking for. It wouldn't atone for what he had done. It had been an unforgivable act. Even with those words ringing around his mind, he still couldn't stop himself from carefully lifting her towards him with his left arm and lowering his head to her throat. She tensed in his arms, her heart skipping a beat and causing his to do the same. "I will not hurt you," he whispered in the dragon tongue, and then added in his own language, the one she couldn't understand. "I swear I will never hurt you again, Kiara. Never. Let me take care of you, please, for this moment. Let me think of you as mine." Her eyes searched his, implored him to speak in a way she could grasp, but he couldn't. He wasn't ready to acknowledge what was happening or what it meant, that it meant anything at all. He wasn't strong enough to bear that part of himself he had guarded for millennia, not when he knew she would crush him in return. "Let me take care of you," he murmured in the elf tongue. She seemed to get the message from the gentleness of his voice, or perhaps she was picking up on the feelings running through him, the emotions he wasn't quite able to conceal because he didn't know how to control the connection between them, if it was possible to control it at all. She relaxed and he dropped his lips to her throat, coursed them over it and breathed her in, stealing a moment with her before he began licking the wounds to clean them and halt the flow of blood, helping them heal. A shudder racked him, pulling a moan up his throat that he managed to swallow back down before it could escape. She tasted divine. Resist. He was trying, but fuck, she was everything sweet and light and warm, and he wanted to drown in her as he lapped at her throat, running his tongue over her skin. She trembled in his arms. Oh, dear gods, resist! Blue frowned and stilled, his breath washing back at him from her skin, carrying her intoxicating scent with it. Sweet gods, even that is too much. His left eyebrow rose. His eyes shot wide and he pulled away from her throat and looked over his shoulder at the unconscious female near the open cell door. Unconscious fey female. Unconscious siren. He had drunk deeply from her, and by stealing her blood he had temporarily stolen her abilities, a skill all elves possessed and one that was normally useful. Not torture as it was this time. Torture because he could hear Taryn's thoughts in his head as if she was speaking them aloud. He stopped. Was it wrong that he found it intensely satisfying that she sounded disappointed? He tried to tell himself to warn her that he could hear her, that he was prying and it was wrong of him, but for some reason the words refused to line up on his lips, lips that wanted to caress her skin again, because now that he had tapped into her thoughts, her feelings were coming through loud and clear too. She wanted more. Desire to satisfy his female had him dropping his mouth back to her throat and tenderly sweeping his tongue over it. He focused on cleaning it and tending to her, and that worked, pushing thoughts of a more wicked nature to the back of his mind, until she moaned in his damn head. Gods, the thing this male could do to me with that tongue. Holy fuck, she had to stop thinking like that. It would be his undoing. She was weak, had suffered heavy blood loss because of him. She should have been foggy and focused on recovering, and mad as hell at him, not thinking the sort of things that were suddenly popping into his head. Blue screwed his eyes closed and tried to shut down the telepathic ability. Nothing he tried worked, and Taryn didn't help him. He couldn't exactly focus on stopping himself from hearing her thoughts when they were all too alluring, painting pictures in his head that had him instantly hard and aching for her despite his healing injuries. His skin is so warm. Would it feel hot pressed against mine, our bare flesh touching? Gods, it would. I can feel it now, stroking mine as he slides between my thighs, taking me. A possessive growl rumbled up his throat, and he couldn't stop this one from escaping. Not when he was imagining everything she was thinking, picturing them tangled together, and their incomplete bond demanded he satisfy his female. She tensed in his arms. Is it so wrong that I get flushed with fire whenever he growls? Holy fuck, female! Blue snapped and pulled back, releasing her and shooting to his feet. His legs wobbled, but they didn't collapse. He pressed his palms to his groin, keeping the small scrap of black cloth over it to give himself some dignity, and paced away from her. He needed to breathe. No. What he needed to do was fulfill every damn fantasy running rampant through her mind. Chapter 21. Blue stalked back towards her and caught himself at the last second, right before he was about to yank her up into his arms and kiss the breath from her, and snarled as he spun on his heel and walked away again. His blood pounded. He couldn't do this. Whatever this was. She wasn't his. They weren't meant to be. It didn't matter that she was his fated one. There was no future for them, and the quicker he got that message, the better. He needed more than a biological connection to her to make him belong to her. He needed something that she could never give him. Their history was too dark, too filled with pain and hatred. She could never love him, and as much as he despised how weak it made him, love was what he needed, what he had always craved from his mate. He stopped near the back wall of the cell, pressed his forehead against the black stone, and exhaled hard. All of his dreams of his Kiara had been centered around her loving him. Taryn had made it clear more than once that what she felt for him was quite the opposite. Her trying to help him meant nothing. It was probably just her instincts as his fated female making her behave that way, not her feelings for him. Gods, his bottom is incredible. He gritted his teeth and pretended that thought didn't rub his ego the right way. It didn't prove that she felt anything other than hatred or that it wasn't her instincts making her protect him. But then, every inch of him is incredible. That sultry low whisper in his mind, almost a purr of approval, rubbed him the right way so hard that he was solid as a rock and tenting the tiny piece of black material around his hips. Holy fuck. He was either weak from everything he had been through and had no control over himself because of it, or she had a wicked way with words that worked magic on him. He looked down at his raging erection and huffed when his heart supplied that it was the latter. He was stronger now, his wounds already knitting back together thanks to the sirens and her blood, and very much in control of himself. Scratch that. She was very much in control. My throat feels better. I am stronger. I should tell him and ease his concern, but I think I would rather remain here admiring the view. Perhaps I could say something to make him look around. Then I can take in all that masculine beauty he wears so well. Blue whirled to face her, hands dropping to cover his groin as the piece of black cloth threatened to fall off. Empty your mind, he snapped, because her thoughts were both a wicked pleasure and sheer torture. Her eyes gradually widened. A fierce blaze burned up her pale cheeks. Dear gods, he can hear me! She scooted backwards, her embarrassment flowing through their link to him, and didn't stop until she was far away from him, her back pressing against the bars of the cell near the door, as far from him as she could get. That seemed to be the story of his long life. The moment whatever was happening between him and a female stopped, they distanced themselves. He couldn't remember ever spending the night with a woman tucked in his arms. Maybe it had happened, maybe not. He felt sure he would have remembered it, though, that it would have been special and would have seared itself on his mind forever. What would Taryn feel like in his arms? Would she feel as good as she had a moment ago? Her body cushioning his, tucked close. Her soft breaths filling his ears and telling him he wasn't alone. Gods, he could easily imagine passing the long hours of darkness watching her sleep peacefully, safely tucked up in his arms. He kept his right hand over his groin but shoved the fingers of his left one through his hair, yanking it back. What the hell was wrong with him? He smiled wryly. Wasn't that the perfect question to sum up his life? What was so wrong with him that no one could love him? He wanted to slide down the wall to sit with his back pressed against it, but if he gave in to the urge, he was liable to flash his private parts at the female. He wasn't sure whether it would please or shock her. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. He just wanted to find his feet again, his place if he was honest with himself, his purpose. He stared across the cell at her, a sea of blood-soaked black flagstones separating them. Her violet to white eyes locked with his, the rosy hue on her cheeks grew darker, and she dropped her gaze to her knees. I'm sorry, he said in her language, and she jerked her head back up, her eyes enormous and sweet heart-shaped lips parted. He cast his gaze down at his bare feet. I'm sorry I hurt you. Tanak drugged you, she whispered, and it felt so good to hear her voice again that he wanted to moan. All that came out was a growl as he thought about what her brother had done to him. She grabbed the bars of the cell and pulled herself onto her feet, held them as she tested her legs, moving a few steps back and forth along the wall. When she looked across at him, she was a different female. Stronger, darker. Her anger rolled over him, swept through his blood, and he had to wonder. Could she feel the connection he had forged between them? Was she aware of what he had done by biting her? A sound came from above and her head snapped up, eyes scanning the stone ceiling, breath stilling as she searched for the source of the noise. He lifted his eyes to the ceiling, too, and listened hard, the pointed tips of his ears twitching as he tried to pinpoint where it had come from. Tanak will return, she said, her voice stronger now, a commanding edge to it that he found he liked too much. It stirred wicked thoughts, memories of his dreams of her, and he had to fight to keep his feet planted to the ground, stopping himself from crossing the room and making those dreams come true. A frown flickered on her brow, her cheeks darkened another shade, and she slid her eyes down to him, pierced him with a look that said she didn't need to be telepathic to know his thoughts. Damn. Maybe she was aware of the connection between them after all. "We must go." She shuffled to the unconscious female, crouched and checked her pulse. Blue just stared at her, sure he had heard her wrong. The cold that stole over him, pushing all of the softer feelings from his heart and hardening it, said that he had heard her right. "I cannot leave." He shook his head and shifted his focus back to the ceiling. "I have to retrieve the sword." There was no way that he could leave it in the hands of her brother. The male was a maniac, far worse than Vale had ever been. With the sword in his possession, he could fulfill his twisted fantasy of bringing all of hell to its knees. "Neither of us are in any fit state to battle my brother," she snapped and rose to her feet, turned and glared at him. "Deny it if you dare." He couldn't because it was true. While drinking from the Fae and from Terran had restored some of his strength, the drugs her brother had dosed him up with had yet to leave his system. It wasn't the healing wounds his body bore that posed a threat to him either. It was the darkness. He could feel it trickling through him still, a deadly undercurrent in his blood that stirred dangerous thoughts that would pierce his mind from time to time, black urges that pushed him to do things he found repulsive whenever the darkness's hold on him faded. It was only Terran's blood keeping it at bay right now, restoring the light in his soul whenever the darkness rose to steal control. The effect she had on him could shatter at any moment, and he knew without a doubt that the darkness would seize command again if it did. He needed time to master it again and purge it from his soul. Fighting her brother would do the opposite. He would need to draw on his full strength in order to win against the dragon male, and that meant tapping into the darkness. He would end up giving it a stronger grip on him, giving it more control over him, and he wasn't sure whether he would be able to come back from that, or whether he would end up tainted, possibly even lost. Terran turned towards the open cell door and paused there with her back to him. "I will have to bide my time," she whispered, and her fists clenched at her sides. "When I am stronger, I can return to free the others and deal with my brother." Blue stared at her as those words sank in, and he realized that she hadn't come to this place to join forces with her brother. She had come here to destroy him. He couldn't believe it. "Was taking down your brother the reason you stole the blade in the first place?" His voice was surprisingly strong in his ears, no longer rough and scratchy. He rubbed his throat, found it no longer hurt to touch it, and then looked down at his body, expecting to find it battered. The wounds on his torso were healing fast. Thanks to Terran's blood? He had heard that a mate's blood could swiftly restore an elf's strength, but he hadn't expected it to be this powerful. It was incredible. Far better than the wretched medicine most elves had to take when in this condition. A concoction that would instantly heal but rolled all of the pain the person taking it would have felt during the course of naturally healing into one excruciating blast. He hazarded a guess that he would be fully healed within less than a day. His body, at least. His mind and soul were a different matter. The darkness twisted tendrils tighter around his consciousness, sinking poisoned thorns into him and stirring black desires. He shoved them from his mind and pushed away from the wall, and cool air swirled around his bare legs as he walked. She looked back at him over her shoulder, something glittering in her eyes that he couldn't quite decipher, and then turned away again. Her voice flickered in his mind, shocking him more than the fact she was on a mission to kill her sibling. "If I told him I did not steal the blade, would he believe me? I have been such a fool. I should not have tried to protect Tenak by taking the sword, and the blame with it. No, the elves are to blame too. They should not have turned on me when I tried to give the sword back." Everything she felt flowed through him too, backing up her words as he experienced her guilt and sorrow, her fear and her anger. "You were bringing it back," he said in the dragon tongue, and she gasped and whirled to face him. Her legs buckled. He was across the room in an instant, catching her in his arms and stopping her fall. Her hands pressed against his bare chest as he drew her closer to him, her eyes leaping to meet his, her soft pink lips parted. "You were bringing it back," he whispered, transfixed by the electric feel of her touching him and the way she was looking up at him, her beguiling eyes filled with shock but other feelings too, ones he was coming to learn as they filtered through the bond to him. Desire, hunger, hope, fear. He wasn't the only one afraid of what was happening, convinced that it was impossible. That gave him strength, courage, made him brave and a little reckless. He dropped his gaze to her lips, narrowed it on them. They parted further, a tempting invitation. Gods, he wanted to take it. He wanted to devour her. He dragged his eyes away and exhaled hard, purging those desires and restoring balance again. He wanted her, but now wasn't the time, and it certainly wasn't the place. He needed to get her away from the castle, get his strength back up, and then deal with her brother and reclaim the sword. Once he had done all that, then he could think about asking her whether she might consider falling in love with him. Like he was falling in love with her. "Yes," she murmured, and he frowned, again convinced for a moment that she could hear his thoughts before he realized she had been answering the question he had posed to her, not the one he had been thinking about. She had tried to bring the sword back, and his men had attacked her. She had taken the blame for her brother, and he knew deep in his heart that wouldn't have changed if he and his men had given her a chance to return the sword. She would have covered for her sibling, pretending she had been the one to take the blade. She would have taken the punishment in his stead. Brave little female. Her loyalty and courage only strengthened his growing feelings for her. Feelings that had started in him centuries ago, and he had been denying ever since. But he was too tired and drained of strength to deny them now. With her in his arms, resting gently against him, her eyes settled on his. He couldn't pretend they didn't exist. She was so beautiful. A blush crept onto her cheeks again, and she dropped her gaze to his chest, the innocent edge to her behavior only stirring his desire for her, his need to protect her and claim her as his mate. That blush deepened as she lowered her eyes further. She slowly pushed out of his arms and fidgeted with the bottom of her corset where it met her violet leathers, her gaze locked on it, avoiding him. He frowned at her behavior and was about to ask her why she had pulled away from him again, when she murmured, My magic is weak. My brother received almost all of it. But perhaps I can, I might be able to. Her cheeks blazed and she pointed towards him, flicking her finger up and down his body. He looked down at himself. He had forgotten that he only wore a ridiculously small cloth around his hips. Blue closed his eyes and focused, testing the limit of his abilities. The drug the dragon had given him to unleash his darker nature was different to the one that had been in his system when he had come around in the cell. That one had faded, unlocking more of his gifts, including the one that allowed him to teleport a pair of black leather trousers from his apartments in the elf castle onto his legs. Taryn gasped. "Your magic is strong." "It isn't magic," he said, and pulled the scrap of cloth out of his trousers, tossed it away, and then fastened the lacing over his crotch. He looked up at her as he finished tying the string. "I think it is something like telekinesis." "You are not sure?" She frowned at him and he shrugged, shooting for casual, but it came off stiff. He had never really cared about people questioning his knowledge or his intelligence. For some damned reason, he cared that she was looking at him as if he was an idiot, though. "I don't think anyone is sure how to classify our teleportation abilities," he grumbled and held his hand out to her. She stared at it as if it was going to bite her, or maybe as if he was going to bite her. "I only intend to teleport you away from this place to somewhere safe." He rolled his fingers, silently ordering her to take his hand. She didn't move, even though he could sense she wanted to go with him. Something was holding her back. Her brother. "I will not allow him to use the sword. As soon as I am strong enough, I will return with my team and we will deal with him." Blue looked down at his hand and then up into her eyes. "So come with me." I changed my mind. She shook her head. I cannot go. Leave without me. You are strong enough. If my brother discovers I am gone, he will be furious. He will use the sword. I have to stay. Stay? His eyes leaped between hers. Have you lost your mind? Her eyes blackened, and he had the feeling he had prodded a very tender nerve. The last time he had seen her flashed across his eyes, a replay of a dark arena and a black wooden stage, and her fighting on it, attacking her captors like a wild thing, crazed with a need to hurt them. His eyes fell to her wrists, and she quickly put her arms behind her back, hiding them from him. She couldn't hide the scars around her neck, though. How many times had she been captured and sold? He wanted to ask her that, but her turbulent feelings and her striking eyes pleaded him to keep that question to himself, told him that she wasn't strong enough to answer it right now. He would give her the time she needed, but she would answer it. He would know the things she had been through, and the faces of those who had done them to her, and he would track them down and butcher them all. They would pay for hurting his female. A sharp bang came from above, echoing down the spiral stairwell to them. Go, she whispered, a frantic edge to her gaze as it leaped from the stairwell to him. Now! No, he barked and stepped towards her, caught her arm and growled at her. Not without you. I will not leave without you. I will not leave you here so that madman can hurt you. Never. She jerked free of his grip and snarled at him. I cannot go. Tenak will be furious. He will take up the sword and turn his gaze on those he believes are his enemies. From what I have heard, that is the whole of hell. The sword will give him power, but he will need an army to back him if he expects to conquer hell. Blue grabbed her arm again, his grip tighter this time. Her eyes turned wild, fear lancing her, and he softened his grip, instinct screaming at him that he was terrifying her. He growled low in his throat. By the gods, he would know the things she had been through, and he would kill everyone who had harmed her, who had scarred her. We have time, Terran. I will not leave you here. I will not go with you. Conviction shone in her beautiful eyes. He felt like a bastard before the words even left his lips. Then you give me no choice. He dragged her against him, banded his arm around her waist, and pinned her against his chest. I will kidnap you. She wriggled and pushed against him, palms hot against his bare flesh, sending a fierce fiery current through him. Her startled gasp said she had felt it too. Her breath hitched, her pupils dilated to devour the white around the center of her irises, and his heart raced in unison with hers. Let me go, she whispered, voice distant, telling him that she was as lost in the sudden rush of emotions and feelings as he was. Blue shook his head. Never. Her eyes widened. You are coming with me whether you like it or not. He growled down at her. I will not leave you here. But my brother will. I don't care. He snapped and she stilled. He softened his tone and searched her eyes. I don't care. All I care about is getting you out of harm's way. I will deal with the consequences when they happen. Her throat worked on a hard swallow. She blinked. Take me to the dragon realm, then, she said, and wrapped her arms around his neck, frazzling his ability to think. He could only feel, and gods, it felt too good to have her this close to him, curling around him, holding on to him. He never wanted her to let go. Her low-spoken words reached his ears, shaking him out of his stupor. Tenak will think I went flying, or perhaps pursued you. I will use the time to regain my strength, and when I am strong enough, I will return to my brother and tell him that you overpowered me and escaped, and I went after you. I will make him believe me. She would get herself killed. He tightened his grip on her, willed his portal to open, and focused on his destination. Chapter 22. Darkness swallowed them, cool against his skin, and then separated to reveal the green valley. The grasses swayed in the gentle breeze, and sunlight warmed his skin and made the stone of the stronghold look more cream than gray. Beyond the hill where it stood, mountains rose. a range of peaks that were green with trees on the elf side and black as night on the side of the first realm of the demons. Taryn looked away from him, incredible eyes scanning the sweeping landscape, and shook her head. "No," she whispered and snapped back around to face him. Her eyes gained a wild edge again. Panic swept through her and rushed into him. "Not here. It's not safe here." He opened his mouth to tell her that it was. Leif, Dacian, and Finn appeared a few meters away from him. Blue instantly pinned Taryn to his chest, keeping her face hidden from them so they wouldn't know she was aware of them. She stiffened against him, heart thundering against his chest, causing his own to race. "Play at being unconscious," he whispered in the dragon tongue, keeping his lips as still as possible so his men wouldn't see he was speaking to her. Her fingers tensed against his bare chest. He took it as a sign she would do as he asked and raised his head, looked at all three males where they stood opposite him, their eyes on Taryn. He had hoped they would be away from the garrison, giving him a chance to use it as a safe house for Taryn, a place where they could clean up and rest while he figured out what to do, and came to terms with what she was to him. Leif drew his blade out of the air, and Dacian and Finn followed suit, arming themselves. All three changed clothing in unison, their uniforms of a long black jacket and black trousers and riding boots disappearing, replaced by their figure-hugging black armor. Blue barely bit back the growl that rose up his throat, every primal instinct firing and telling him to protect his female. These males meant to hurt her. They wanted to take her from him. She trembled against him. Leif stepped forwards and pointed his sword at Taryn. "Set her away from you. She is dangerous." Finn closed in and reached out to grab her arm, to steal her from him. A red mist descended and Blue hissed at the younger elf, his pointed ears flaring back against the sides of his head. He flashed his fangs and narrowed his gaze on the male, warning him to back off and forget any ideas he had about taking his female from him. She was his. No other male would touch her. None would take her from him. "I will deal with her," he snarled and struggled with the dark urges running rampant through him. The hunger to lash out at these males and kill them all in order to protect his female. Dacian's eyes narrowed in a way he didn't like. The warrior had remained at a distance, his focus fixed on Blue, not the female, gaze cool and just a touch too inquisitive, a touch too knowing. The larger male lowered his broadsword and stabbed the tip of the black blade into the earth. His eyes didn't leave Blue. "The female is dangerous," Dacian said, voice a deep rumble, testing him. The male pointed, ran a finger up and down in the air. "She certainly worked you over." Blue cursed under his breath and realized why two of his men had reacted so strongly to her presence. He looked like an unholy mess. He had forgotten that the moment Taryn had been in his arms. He had forgotten all about his wounds and the blood that covered him when she had nestled close to him. Her breath washed across his bare chest, soft pants that tickled his skin. Gods, he was sure he would forget his own damned name if she acted on those desires he had heard running through her mind back in the cell when he had been touching her, tasting her. His cock twitched, hunger rising again, stirred by his thoughts and by the feel of her against him, her warm body pressed close, bare skin caressing his. Finn foolishly took another step forwards. Blue snarled at him, baring his fangs, and tightened his grip on her. Dacian's eyes narrowed further. "The female is not the one who took the sword, and not the one who did this to me." Blue forced his voice to work, shoved his out-of-control instincts back in place, and faced off against Dacian. The bastard knew what he was trying to hide. Blue shot him a look that he hoped conveyed that the male wasn't the only one who knew a secret someone was trying to keep. Another secret related to fated females. It took a male who had found his fated one to know one. Dacian's violet eyes slid towards Finn, and then he looked down at his boots. Blue hadn't failed to notice the way Dacian had acted around Finn's younger sister. He felt wretched just thinking about it, but if Dacian dared to mention the reason why Blue felt so overprotective of Taryn, then he would turn the tables on him and tell Finn that his little sister was Dacian's fated one. That would buy him enough time to escape with Taryn at least. "I must take her to the castle so we can question her." It was the safest course of action now. He could speak with Lauren about her and perhaps clear her name. Blue slid his hand lower on her back and she tensed against him, a little gasp escaping her. He tried to tune into her thoughts, hungry to know whether she was thinking wicked things again, was enjoying being in his arms. Her thoughts were hazy and he couldn't make them out. The effect of the siren's blood was wearing off. It was probably a good thing, but he still wanted to curse it. Those thoughts she'd had back in the cell had given him a clearer picture of her feelings, and had made him realize that she didn't hate him, and that whatever she was feeling, it wasn't born of her instincts. She desired him. Gods, he desired her. He needed her so badly that he felt sure he might go mad if he didn't catch a glimpse of her face soon, didn't look into her eyes and see them bright with a hint of affection. He gritted his teeth and resisted the need to look down at her, to catch her under her chin and make her look at him so he could fulfill that desire. He had to keep his head if he was going to get her through this unscathed, and without him attacking his own men. If he showed her any tenderness, the two males watching him with their weapons at the ready would question his authority, believing him under her influence and unable to perform his duties. "We should take her into the stronghold and question her there. It is the safer course of action and will not endanger anyone at the castle. Is that not the reason why we came to this place?" Leif lowered his gaze to the female and flexed his fingers around the leather-bound hilt of his black sword. "She is not a danger to anyone," Blue said, and all three men looked skeptical. He frowned at them all. "I said she did not harm me. It was her brother, the sibling we heard about from the dragons." None of them looked as if they believed him, and Finn edged closer again, moving in time with Leif. "We will take her to the stronghold first, and if she offers any valuable information, then we will transfer her to the castle." Blue barely bit back the growl that rumbled up his throat as the two elves closed in, their eyes flickering between him and Terran. Dacian remained at a distance, his eyes fixed on Blue, never straying to the female in his arms. Wise male. He knew that any attempt to take her from him would incite his rage, and he wouldn't be able to stop himself from attacking in order to protect her. "We should listen to our commander," Dacian said, and Leif and Finn both halted and looked back at him. "He has not steered us wrong in the past. We saw the way those dragons reacted when pressed to speak of her brother, and the female is injured too." Blue flexed his fingers around her waist and looked between all three men, sending a prayer to his gods that Leif and Finn would listen to Dacian and back down. They didn't mean any harm by wanting to take the burden of her from his arms and escort her to the cell, but they were pushing him without knowing it, testing the limit of his ability to control himself. His eyes leaped from Leif to Finn and then back to Dacian, a motion he repeated as he monitored all three of them, constantly assessing them as he fought the deep primal urge to lower Terran to the ground and lash out at them, to drive them back and eliminate them if they didn't relent. His breathing quickened, heart pumping harder as he prepared himself for a fight. Terran shifted against him, a small movement but one he felt to the very marrow of his bones. She brushed her fingers across his chest, a touch that soothed the ragged and dangerous side of himself, the one still dancing with the darkness that the drug and the bloodshed had unleashed in him. "Commander Blue," Dacian said, a note of warning in his deep voice together with an unspoken question. Was he going to be all right? Blue drew down a deep, shuddering breath, closed his eyes, and exhaled slowly. When he opened his eyes again, all three men were studying him closely. "The male drugged me." It was a reasonable explanation for his unusual behavior, and one he felt sure they would believe if he added a few details he had intended to keep private. He closed his eyes again and lowered his head, and gods, Terran smelled wonderful as his breath washed off her hair and her shoulder. His mouth watered, fangs itching for another taste of her. He tamped down that dark hunger and focused on the lighter side of the feelings she stirred in him, the side that drew comfort from her scent. "I was forced to attack someone. A fey female." Someone gasped. Blue lifted his eyes, heaved a sigh, and pushed out. "The female dragon stopped me from killing her, and I attacked her instead. I almost killed her too." Leif rocked back on his heels as if Blue had struck him with those words, and stared at Terran, disbelief mingling with fury in his violet eyes. Blue had to bite his tongue to stop himself from growling at the male, and did the only thing he could do to make them see he was telling the truth about her, and the heinous thing he had done as repayment for her kindness. He gently lowered her in his arms, and she did wonderfully well at pretending she was unconscious, her body so limp he was almost convinced himself. Her arms fell away from him as he leaned over her, splaying out at her sides and making her look as if she was falling through the air. He studied her blood-stained face as he kneeled and carefully laid her down on the dewy grass. His beautiful Kiara. He could feel the tremor of her fear in his blood, and willed her to feel he was with her and believed that he wouldn't allow anything bad to happen to her. He had gone against her wishes, but the dragon realm wasn't safe for her, and he couldn't allow her to commit suicide by returning to her brother without him. Her violet to white hair spilled away from her throat, cascading across the bright green grass, and her head slipped towards her right, revealing the ragged marks on the left side of her throat. Blue rose onto his feet and looked down at her, at what he had done to her. It was hard to look at her when she was laying on the grass, her knees together and twisted towards her right, hips rotated but shoulders against the earth, and her arms spread at her sides. Her throat ravaged and blood staining her moon-white skin. She looked dead. She might have been if he hadn't stopped when he had. He had come perilously close to killing her. "I did this to her," Blue husked. He cleared his throat, but it did nothing to remove the rawness from it. "She is not our enemy. Our fight lies with her brother." Leif and Finn closed in again. Leif made the mistake of flexing his clawed fingers around the hilt of his sword, readying it. Blue couldn't stop the reaction as it swept through him, his defenses so battered and heart so bruised that it was impossible to retain control. The male wanted war, and he would get it. No one would touch his female. He had sworn to keep her safe, and he would, no matter what it took. He fixed cold eyes on Leif and drew his black blade from the air, teleporting it into his left hand. He swept his right palm up the length of the sword, transforming it into a double-ended spear. His ears grew pointier and flattened against the sides of his head as darkness swept through him, an oily rising tide that obliterated the light that Terran had brought into his soul, and left only black hunger behind. Blue snarled through his fangs, raised his spear, and prepared to attack. Chapter 23. Dacian appeared right in front of Blue, his right hand shooting out to curl around the shaft of his spear and holding it fast. "Not wise," the larger male whispered in a low voice, one that told Blue to listen and consider his actions. It was hard when Leif was still standing on the other side of Terran, sword ready to strike her down. Harder still now that Dacian was standing between him and his female, blocking his path to her, stirring the darker side of his instincts that roared to protect her. The males meant to take her from him. They meant to harm her. His grip on his spear tightened, and he wrestled with Dacian, trying to tug it free of his grip so he could cut the male down and reach his female. A low snarl curled up his throat, and Dacian's eyes narrowed, blazing violet as his pointed ears flared back against the shorn sides of his head, a show of aggression that only sent Blue sinking deeper into the dark hunger for violence rising inside him. "Listen to reason, Blue," Dacian growled, and Blue froze, knocked right out of the grip of the darkness and onto his backside by one single word. He couldn't remember the last time Dacian had used his name without his rank. "Commander Blue is still under the influence of the drug and the torture inflicted by the dragon male. I suggest you back down, Leif, as you are inciting his rage and allowing the darkness to gain a firmer hold on our leader." Dacian kept his eyes locked on Blue's, as he raised his voice loud enough that the whole damn valley could probably hear him. There he went again, pulling out the big words. "Unless you would prefer me to send a report to Prince Lauren about what happened here, and why Commander Blue reduced your scrawny backside to a pile of blood, skin, and broken bones." That was the Dacian that Blue was more comfortable with, the one he could understand, the warrior. Leif's eyes darkened, but he lowered his sword. Evidently, threatening to give Leif a bad name with Lauren was the best method of keeping him in line. Blue would have to remember that. "Your orders?" Leif said, an edge to his expression that told Blue he knew what they were without asking, and he wasn't happy. "We take her to the castle, and I will speak with Prince Lauren." Blue put as much authority into his words as he could muster, making it clear that he wasn't going to accept any objections. "And get some medical attention," Dacian added, his rugged face sober and unreadable. "You look like hell." The big warrior cracked a grin, as if Blue needed the reminder. Now that Taryn was no longer in his arms, he could feel every ache in his battered bones, every throb in his muscles as they struggled to hold him upright. Her blood was healing him, quickening the process, but he was still weak. He needed sustenance and something to purge the drugs from his body. Not the damned medicine, though. Never the medicine. He hated that shit. He needed rest. He doubted that was going to happen. The moment he told Lauren about what had occurred and what he had discovered, his prince would send him back out to finish what he had started. Dacian backed off and joined Finn and Leif. Wind blew across the green land, stirring the grass. Blue looked down at Taryn where she lay at his feet, the breeze playing with the blood-stained threads of her hair. The thought of taking her to the elf castle was both a balm and a poison. She would be safe there because the castle was heavily guarded, but she would be in danger too. Everyone in the castle still believed she was responsible for stealing the sword. He would need to make sure she was protected while he spoke with Prince Lauren about her and her brother. He sent his spear back through his portal to his room in the castle, bent and scooped her up into his arms, and she rolled towards him as he adjusted her weight, her head coming to rest against his bare shoulder and skin warming his. He wished he could teleport her to his apartments as he could his weapon, but while he could send items there directly, he couldn't enter the castle through that route. He had to use the main portal in the courtyard. That meant teleporting her into an area where there were always soldiers around. Unmated males. He wanted to stay with her, too, to keep her by his side, but it would be impossible. He couldn't take her to meet with Lauren. The guards wouldn't allow it, his men wouldn't, and even he wouldn't go through with it, because there was no way in the three realms he was going to place his prince in danger. He didn't believe Taryn was in on the plan with her brother, but he was hardly thinking clearly right now, his brain addled by the incomplete bond between them. He had to meet with Lauren alone and discuss everything with him. That meant leaving Taryn in the care of his team. Leif still looked as if he wanted to hurt her. Finn no longer looked certain. Dacian looked as if he would hurt any who lifted a finger to harm her, his powerful arms folded across his chest as he stood guard close to Blue, and his violet eyes challenging Leif to defy his order. If Blue had to choose one of the three to stand on his side, he would have chosen Dacian. The warrior was fiercely protective of those he cared about, and loyal to a fault. Not only that, but the thought of Dacian near Taryn didn't stir a black urge to kill the male. Blue had seen him with his fated one, and the knowledge that he had a female of his own, even one that didn't belong to him yet, tempered the primal instincts that were commanding him to attack any male who so much as looked at Taryn. He would trust Dacian to take care of her in his stead while he spoke with Lauren. Blue closed his eyes and willed his portal. He tucked Taryn closer to his chest as the green-purple light flashed over his body and the darkness swallowed him. It felt colder this time, a biting chill that stung his flesh and seared his bones. The darker side that all elves possessed affected everything in their life, including their abilities. The icy air that froze his lungs in the short span of time between disappearing from the land near the stronghold and reappearing in the castle courtyard was a product of that. He had never felt it before, and gods, he never wanted to feel it again. He would slowly piece himself back together, purge the darkness from his soul, and find his balance again to ensure that happened. Taryn tensed as they appeared, the leafy green trees and neatly mown grass of the courtyard shimmering into being around them. Warm light reflected off the pale gray stone of the castle, but soaked into the darker bands. He lowered his gaze from the towering conical roof-tipped spires of the castle, down the pale gravel path that led from the arched entrance of the building, to the circular portal landing area, and then to her. Her violet to white eyes were huge, speaking of the fear that ran through her blood and through his, too. "You will be safe here," he whispered in her tongue, but her expression didn't shift, her dark eyebrows remaining furrowed and eyes fearful. Gods, he wanted to brush his fingers across her cheek and reassure her. The feel of so many pairs of eyes on him stopped him, though, and fear of what might happen should any witness his affection for her, see that he was biased where she was concerned, kept him remaining at a distance. He set her down on her feet and held her steady when her legs wobbled. Dacian stepped forwards and Blue looked over her head at him. "Take care of the female while I speak with Prince Lauren." Fuck. Those were some of the most difficult words he had ever had to say. It was hard to remain cold and distant, to act indifferent, when he could feel Taryn's fear and hear her heartbeat kick up a notch, as she realized he was going to leave her alone in a castle filled with elves who all thought she had stolen the sword and was their enemy. It was hard to resist looking at her. Somehow he managed it when Dacian pressed his right hand to his chest in a salute. Blue pushed off, the ache in his chest growing with each step he took that carried him further from her. Her eyes remained locked on him as he walked the straight, pale path that cut through the orchard towards the castle, searing his back with the heat of her gaze, making him itch to turn back around, grab her hand and pull her with him, filling him with a terrible black urge to fight any who stood in the way of him taking his female somewhere he deemed safe. He had lied to her. She wasn't safe here. This was the worst possible place he could have taken her, but he had to speak with Prince Lauren. He needed to speak with him. About the sword, about Taryn, about everything. His reason for coming to the castle wasn't solely to report to his prince. It was to speak with Lauren about what she was to him. It was to seek his advice. His palms sweated at the thought of telling Lauren everything, confessing that Taryn was his fated female. He rubbed them on his leathers as he approached the entrance of the castle, and nodded to the two males guarding it, their black armor a stark contrast against the pale stone of the arch. Gods, the last time he had felt this nervous about entering the castle had been the first time he had come here over 42 centuries ago, brought before Lauren to tell him about what had happened on the battlefield where Vale had gone mad and slaughtered his own men. He halted before he reached the entrance, the sound of running water arresting his steps. He turned towards the source of the noise, a fountain off to his left, and diverted course. As he strode towards it, he called a cloth to his hands. Meeting with Lauren while covered in blood would not be a wise move, not if he was going to convince his prince that the female dragon was no threat to them. Lauren leaned towards overprotective, a trait that was good for a prince, but bad where he was concerned. The male coddled him too much, and seeing him bloodied and battered would trigger an episode of fussing that Blue didn't want to deal with right now on top of everything else. He dunked the cloth in the crystal-clear water, pulled it free, and ran it over his blood-stained skin, scrubbing himself clean. It smelled tinny as he used it to wipe the thick crust of blood off his neck and face. When the cloth was deep red, dripping crimson onto the pale gravel, he sent it away, back to his bathing room in his apartment, and looked himself over. A marginal improvement in his appearance. Deep red gashes still crisscrossed his chest and arms, angry scarlet around their edges, and his skin was still pinker than usual from all the blood. But it would do. He couldn't exactly dunk himself in the fountain as he wanted. The damned thing was sacred. He had already gained a multitude of black glares and looks that questioned his sanity by using the water to wash himself off. If he got blood in the water, he would probably find himself strung up in the cells. He blew out his breath and quickly headed towards the arched entrance of the castle. The guards eyed him as he passed, and he swiftly moved through the ground floor of the castle, his bare feet silent on the cool stone flags. The pale stone walls glittered in the warm glow from the lights along the ceiling. White statues towered above him on either side of the grand hallway, standing at intervals between elegantly carved columns that looked like pristine flowers made of ice. The old kings and queens of the elf kingdom. Lauren's bloodline. Blue had never known any of them, but he had walked this hallway so many times that he knew every detail of their faces and their clothing. He kept his eyes locked on the wooden door at the far end of the wide corridor, exhaled hard and inhaled again, wrestling with his nerves. Lauren was in the throne room beyond those doors. Blue could feel him. He looked back towards the entrance behind him. The brightness of the outside world made the archway a blur of white light, impossible for him to see beyond. His steps slowed and he turned back towards it. Taryn was out there, unmated males surrounding her. He growled and took a step back towards her, forced himself to stop, and spun on his heel to face the closed wooden doors again. As much as he wanted to return to her and protect her from every male in the castle, ensuring none looked at her and that she was his and his alone, he had to keep moving forwards. The only real way of protecting his female was to explain everything to Lauren, and request he inform everyone in the castle that Taryn wasn't the enemy and was not to be touched, or even looked at. Blue growled low in his throat, satisfied by the thought of Lauren telling everyone that they couldn't so much as look at her. She was his, and only he could gaze upon her beauty. He clenched his fists, gritted his teeth, and growled again. Thinking like that was only going to get him into trouble, both with others and with her. He had witnessed Lauren in the throes of the mating urge, suffering from an incomplete bond to Olivia. He had seen King Thorn of the Demons go half mad with need of Sable. He had to be stronger than that. He had to keep control and keep a level head. He refused to fall victim of his instincts. Pain shot through him, hot and fierce, tearing his heart asunder and pulling the floor out from under his feet. His knees hit the pale-polished flagstones and he bent over, pressing his palms into the cold stone and panting hard. The fire came again, licking at his bones, searing his flesh, and he cried out. A mighty roar echoed along the corridor at his back. A chill swept over his skin. Taryn. Blue exploded to his feet and teleported to the main portal of the castle where he had left her. She was gone. His heart pounded, her fear colliding with his as he scoured the courtyard for her. Only elves as far as his eyes could see, and he wanted to grab every single one of them and rattle them until they confessed her location. He tried to focus on her blood in his body, but it was hard when every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to find his female. She was afraid, terrified, in pain, suffering. He snarled when he got a fix on her location, and his gaze snapped towards the gate in the inner wall of the castle grounds, settling on the garrison on the other side. Damn them. He would kill them all. He sprinted towards the square 3-story stone building, moving in a blur as his bare feet chewed up the distance between him and his female. He issued the mental command to his armor as he ran, and growled when it didn't come. Fuck. He had forgotten the bastard dragon had stolen it from him. He shouldered the main door open, sharp pain splintering across his bones, and ignored the comments some of the soldiers tossed in his direction as he ran towards the steps that led down off to his right. He leaped the first set, landing in the turning, and then leaped down the second, his feet striking the cobbled floor of the cell block hard enough to get the attention of everyone crowding the corridor between the cells. A flicker of regret shone in Dacian's eyes, but that wasn't going to stop Blue from butchering him later. He had trusted Dacian with his female, and the warrior had failed him. He pinned everyone present with murderous looks, barely holding back the surging tide of darkness, the hunger to do more than glare. He wanted to sink his claws into their flesh and tear them apart for what they had done. As casually as he could when his blood was thundering with a need to kill, and Taryn's fear flowed through him, he walked forwards, chin tipped up and shoulders back. The urge to run to her cell battered him, but he somehow managed to reach the group of males without surrendering to it. They parted for him and he ground his teeth together, his fangs cutting into his gums when he saw Taryn huddled in the corner of the cell. Blue turned on his team. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Following protocol." Leif's calm tone only made Blue bump him to the top of the list. He would be the first Blue would make acquainted with his claws once he had procured new armor. "She had to be placed somewhere secure while you spoke with Prince Lauren." Blue curled his fingers into fists and reined in his fury. It instantly slipped its leash again, and he had to dig his short nails into his palm to stop himself from lashing out at Leif. "I cannot argue that it was not the right course of action, but who gave you permission to hurt her?" He flung one hand towards her, pointing at her where she sat curled into a ball, rocking and muttering to herself. Her pain was crushing, far worse than he had felt in her back in the cell of the Dragon Castle when he had bitten her. It pressed down on his heart, left him feeling as if it might crush it entirely, until nothing remained and all he knew was agony for eternity. "No one hurt her," Leif countered. "We brought her down here and she turned crazed." Liar. He looked across at his little female as she stared at the opposite corner of her cell, eyes dull and lifeless as she chanted to herself in the dragon tongue. "He is coming for me. He is coming for us all. He is coming for me. He is coming," she whispered as she rocked, arms wrapped tightly around her leather-clad knees. Blue slowly frowned as he realized that the only wounds she bore were the ones he had given her. Leif hadn't lied. "Unlock the door," Blue said, and no one moved to obey him. He growled at them, snarling through his fangs as his pointed ears flared back against the sides of his head. "Need to fly," Taryn muttered in the dragon tongue, and her pain worsened, near crippling him as it ripped into his heart. He had to calm her. He couldn't deny that urge, even when he knew that doing so would raise questions in his men, and possibly suspicions too. He didn't care. His female was in pain. She was afraid, suffering. He had to do something to take away her fear and hurt and soothe her. He snatched the keys from the hands of the male in charge and fumbled with them, his hands shaking as he rushed to find the one that would open her door. "Need to fly," she whimpered, and began clawing at her hair, raking blunt nails over her skin and leaving red marks in their wake. "Taryn," Blue said as he found the right key and shoved it into the lock. He growled as his hand shook so violently he almost knocked the damn key back out again and finally managed to turn it. He shoved the door open. Her eyes snapped up to him, bright and clear. She launched to her feet with a growl, barreled into his chest and sent him staggering back into the men behind him, knocking them all down. Her booted feet pressed into his stomach and she kicked off, breaking to her left, running for the courtyard. "Taryn!" Blue scrambled onto his feet and stumbled over the fallen males who were trying to get up too. He growled at them and broke free, bare feet hitting the cobbles as Taryn reached the first bend in the stone staircase. "Taryn!" She didn't slow. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained locked ahead of her up the stairs. Gods damn it. The whole courtyard was filled with soldiers, and if they saw her fleeing the garrison, they would try to stop her, and he wouldn't be able to stop himself from attacking them. He sprinted up the stairs and rushed out into the daylight, eyes watering at the sudden change in brightness. When his vision recovered, he scanned the outer courtyard for her, and then whipped his head towards the arched entrance to the inner courtyard to his left when shouts came from that direction. A roar sounded, and he growled as her head appeared above the top of the wall, white horns brushing the violet scales of her neck as she reared back, standing over 60 foot tall in her dragon form. Arrows flew at her, bouncing off the white plates across her chest. He snarled and teleported, landing in the center of the orchard, facing a small army of archers. Blue spun on his heel to face the other direction, and Taryn loomed over him, her huge front paws swiping at the arrows zipping towards her. One struck her face and she flinched, enormous right eye closing as she tried to protect her sight. A thin line of red blossomed along the path the arrow had taken, from her lip up to the top of her snout. He growled and turned on the archers. "Stand down!" They all looked at him as if he had gone mad, and maybe he had. Maybe he had been mad from the moment he met her, crazy to deny that she was his fated one, his Kiara, his everything. Her broad wings beat the air, their white membrane stretched taut as she spread them, easily spanning the breadth of the courtyard from the interior wall on her right to the castle on her left. She kicked off, shaking the ground and sending a few of the soldiers around him to their knees. Her wings beat harder, sending a gust of wind that drove more men onto their backsides, and she lifted into the air. "Wait!" Blue hollered and waved his arms. She turned wild eyes on him, and he knew in that instant that she wouldn't listen. Whatever madness had gripped her, it was too powerful for her to break free of its hold. He turned as she flew overhead, leaving him as the only male standing, and he could feel her joy as it ran through him. the deep relief she felt as she flew, spreading her wings. Her fear remained, though, lingering in his blood, and he couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. He was coming. Had it been a vision? Had she seen her brother coming for her? For them all? It had clearly shaken her, and he needed to follow her, not only to comfort her. As powerful as that need was, the other that ruled him was equal in strength to it. He needed to find out what she had seen, because he had the feeling that the kingdom was in danger, and it was his fault. He had gone against her wishes and brought her here rather than to the dragon realm. And in doing so, he had turned her brother's focus to this realm and his kin once more. He had given an unbalanced warrior a reason to believe he had kidnapped his sister in order to harm her. And that warrior had a sword that could cut an entire legion of elves down in one swing. "Pursue the dragon!" Leif shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. Soldiers were already forming groups, hunting parties. "Belay that order!" Blue barked, and everyone stopped to look at him. "I will go alone." He teleported before anyone could respond, but in the heartbeat of time between willing his portal and disappearing, he felt the presence of Lauren. Blue reappeared on the brow of a hill a short distance from the castle and looked back at it, the wind that always raced over the green plains tousling his hair and caressing his bare torso. Lauren had witnessed everything. He was going to have to answer some tricky, personal questions when he returned. He didn't care. Maybe he would have once, only a few days ago. But now all he cared about was Terran. Lauren could punish him, could question him in front of every soldier in the castle, could strip him of his rank for insubordination and the fact he had endangered everyone in the elf kingdom. He didn't care what happened to him. He only cared what happened to Terran. She was the only thing that mattered now.